Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Protector of the Fairies in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Protector of the Fairies. He who ran and the man who envied him. You really don't plan on taking your time, do you? Ichigo muttered, avoiding the swing of Baragan's axe with moments to spare before darting back away from the hollow. With a quick slash of his blade, another wave of energy was released only for Baragan to swat it away with the back of his hand, continuing to press his assault. Raising his axe up high, he slammed it down as he finished his leap, the roof cracking under the strain as Ichigo easily avoided the blow and skidded back further across the platform. Waiting for a moment to observe Baragan's movements, the hollow slowly pulling his axe out of the roof, he quickly began muttering the words for a Kida chant, rushing through it as fast as possible before Baragan could notice. With the chant almost finished, he rushed straight back in, Baragan raising his arm back once more as he prepared to swing and counter his blow. Bakuda number 61, Ryukujukura. The 6 beams of light slammed straight into Baragan's arm, holding it in place in the air much to the hollow's shock. Previous Bakudu attempts tended to be worn down rather quickly for some reason, so instead at this moment he would only focus on restraining one part of Baragan's body. It must have bought him only an extra second or two of time, but that was all he needed to finish closing the gap and to be swinging his sword faster than Baragan would be able to stop him. At this current angle he would slice Baragan clean in two, from the shoulder down to his hip. Except his blade didn't make contact. Baragan dodged, moving back before his strike could connect. It was an odd sensation really. Because he knew he was moving faster than Baragan. From what he had seen of Baragan's own abilities, that strike should have made contact. The best Baragan could have hoped for would have been a deep gash, and yet the hollow had moved out of the way entirely with more time to spare than he should have realistically had. And that was why it got confusing. Because in his mind, Baragan wasn't moving any faster. He didn't have a single bit of trouble tracking him, nor did he have to adjust at all. His strikes just weren't reaching Baragan for some reason. It wasn't as bad as it had been initially though. With each strike he made, he was getting closer to working out Baragan's secret. And if he was to take a guess right now, he'd say it was some kind of time magic. Mavis agreed with him that there was something happening, but it was impossible to distinguish its purpose without more evidence. But with 1, maybe 2, more strikes, he would have the connection that he's looking for. Let's see, he muttered to himself, looking for any openings in Baragan's guard. The man's reaction speed was fast, but the nature of his weapon made it difficult to guard while attacking. The strikes left him open, but he made up for that with raw power. A hit from that attack was not one many would want to even risk taking, especially when backed up by that kind of power. But for one who risked getting close and managed to avoid the blow, there was a window of opportunity present. That was why people who used such weapons tended to either watch and react first, limiting the amount of openings present over the battle, or charged in recklessly and never gave up the assault, utilizing their berserker style to make it so that the openings they made weren't able to be exploited. Baragan was certainly the latter, though whether that was a choice born from logic or emotion was unclear. He just knew that every strike sent at him was filled with both anger and impatience, as if Baragan was tired of even waiting the brief time it took for the axe to swing through the air in his attempts to kill him. He avoided glancing towards where Shinji was currently present too, keeping his eyes locked squarely on Baragan at all times. Shinji had probably seen the same thing he had so far. He had even gone as far as to fire off a Hades spell earlier to make sure his friend would have an idea of the kind of effect they'd have on Baragan, and it hadn't managed to hit either. Until he knew what was going on and could make sure Shinji knew, his friend would hold off firing and continue to observe. Not that he blamed him really. Finding a good moment to fire the Zero was hard enough without having to work out how Baragan would dodge, added on top of working out what trick was being used in order to know how to punch through and make contact. Following the usual patterns so far, Baragan was quickly recovering from their previous clash and was rushing back in, this time coating his axe in that strange purple mist from before. He knew better than to let it touch him though, quickly coating his own blades in energy before swinging his shorter blade up. The small Getchuga Tenshou it produced was enough to force Baragan to slow down for a second, even if it did nothing to harm him, and that was enough time for him to approach Baragan and swing out with his own sword against Baragan's axe. His initial intentions to block the blow there and then strike with the smaller blade were immediately halted when the axe broke straight through his own blade. Instincts kicked in and forced him back as fast as he could, his eyes briefly glancing towards his damaged weapon only to find remnants of the mist still clinging to his blade. And worse, they were spreading slowly upwards. Without having to think twice, he discarded his blade to the side, letting it break away in the air until nothing remained. "Yep," he muttered. "Definitely not letting that touch me." His instant restoration could definitely recover from it if he severed the parts of the body affected, but there was hardly time in the fight to do so, and he certainly couldn't accept the weakness it would bring as a result either. "So that mist finds its roots in time magic," he heard Mavis mutter from his shoulder. "I figured he had it playing a role to some degree, but I think we can identify the type now. That mist is using the concepts of aging to an impressive degree really. I don't even want to know how many years it would take for a Zanpakuta to rust, let alone crumble like that. Can you counter it? It'll be useless if all my weapons are crumbling under a single blow. I'll work on some calculations, but for the time being try and handle without it. I'd rather save this card for your Bankai to keep him guessing in case things go wrong." Ichigo gave a brief nod before charging back towards Baragan, quickly forming a new version of the larger version of Zanjutsu in his hand. It was probably too early to play this card, but he was never going to get anywhere if he didn't get chances to test Baragan's defenses. Quickly dodging out of the way of Baragan's axe, he leapt back briefly to avoid the second attack the Hollow managed to launch, all the while beginning to adjust his speed. He was certain Baragan was aware of what he was doing. This attack was known to a lot by now. But experiencing it was another matter, and he didn't believe that Baragan would have the skill able to halt him easily here. Swiping up quickly with his sword only for it to get deflected by Baragan's axe, the mist luckily not surrounding it this time and sparing his weapon the same fate as its last version, he pushed back for a moment and waiting for Baragan to use another of his wide swings. He needed the Hollow as off balance as possible from the move. The swing he wanted quickly appeared before him, Baragan bringing his arm back as he charged for another massive strike. And as the axe swung, he pushed his speed to the limit and completely bypassed him. Baragan's momentum still carried him forward, but the shock of the sight before his eyes was still there and caused him to become locked in that momentum. And for him, who had appeared behind the Hollow with the phantom step, he had the largest opening he had seen from Baragan since the very beginning. There was nothing to stop his sword from slicing straight down Baragan's back. Except as he tried, Baragan's other hand managed to reach back and grab his blade while it was still swinging. His grip threatened to crack the blade itself, but he didn't waste time staying there and letting Baragan retaliate. He had what he needed, so instead he pulled the blade back out across Baragan's hand and retreated across the roof. Finally worked it out, he called over to Baragan, hoping Shinji was listening to him here. "I was wondering why some of my strikes couldn't hit you, despite my advantage in speed. I thought you had saturated the air around you with magic by pulling so much in, but in reality that's just a sign of the constant magic you have at work. You've surrounded yourself in a field of time magic. Stagnation would be the correct classification for it here," he heard Mavis say from his shoulder. "A form of time magic that focuses on the suppression of the flow of time, from extending moments outside of their normal constraints to halting an object's time and locking it in suspended animation. The Kitukisuk used to keep Levi in stasis falls under such a category. So it is exactly as I thought." Glancing back to Baragan from her, he added, "The layer you've set up doesn't extend that far, and that range is tied to your body, but anything that enters it finds their time greatly reduced. Only physically though, however that suddenly difference in time starts to trick the mind. It's why it was hard to notice at first until I realized my body wasn't quite keeping up. And that last moment emphasized it clearly to me." He could tell by the look he was getting that he had hit the nail on the head. Obviously Baragan wasn't happy that his trick had been given away so quickly. But despite his bravado, he still hadn't a proper plan on how to punch through such a barrier. Well, he had one but. "Hey Mavis," he muttered, keeping his voice low so that Baragan wouldn't pick up anything. "Do you think he can adjust how much something is slowed by when it enters that field?" "To a point sure, but that will cost more magic in turn." "Why? You got a plan?" "Maybe. My problem right now is that I'm being slowed down to the point that he can keep up, right? So if I make myself move faster." "That will work," she admittedly. "I was hoping for a more elegant method than hitting things faster though." If it works, it works. Let's see how far Baragan can push this time field of his, shall we? Rushing in towards Baragan, he didn't bother trying to manage his speed at all for any more uses of the Phantom Step. Baragan would now be ready for another one of those, and there was no guarantee it would help if he couldn't utilize the speed to strike afterwards, so better to focus on the plan at hand. If Baragan was caught off guard by the sudden leap in speed, he didn't show it. Instead, Baragan raised his axe and slammed it down into the ground just before he could reach him, using the shockwave to throw him off guard briefly. Taking advantage of that moment, Baragan quickly leapt in, pulling his axe back up with the force of his charge and swinging it up wildly. Quickly slamming a foot against the air, Ichigo narrowly dodged the blow before slicing up with his blade as fast as he could. He could feel the disconnection between his mind and body more clearly this time, his sword not moving as fast as his mind expected it to, but the speed this time was enough to move faster than Baragan could dodge it completely. Doing what he could to mitigate the damage, Baragan leapt back, not fast enough to avoid the blow but still quick enough that it turned the large gash that it would have made across his chest into a small cut across his shoulder, a faint trail of blood starting to leak from the wound. Even if it was minor, Ichigo would take what he could get right now. That was proof that his attacks could still hit, so long as he acted fast enough. Keeping pace with Baragan's attempts to retreat back, he took the chance to press his advantage for the moment, fully aware that it was unlikely to last too long. His larger blade swung down but it was blocked by Baragan's axe, held up by one hand as a guard, just in time. That prevented it from being able to stop the smaller blade, however, stabbing forward and leaving a gash across Baragan's side that had been originally meant to be thrust into the stomach. Throwing Ichigo back as he used his strength to swing his axe out, Baragan for the first time in the fight didn't try to follow his attack up, instead settling with falling back for the moment, which allowed Ichigo the chance to recover and rest. That, for Ichigo, was odd. It was hard for him to even see why Baragan would change his plans too abruptly. Until, that is, he noticed one thing. "You're not healing." It was true. Right before his eyes, Baragan's wounds still remained. The cut on his shoulder still bled and there was a lot of blood leaking out of his side, failing to be stopped by the large hand trying to cover it. A hollow as strong as Baragan was certain to have obtained instant regeneration. He knew just how useful it was himself, and most of the strong hollows he had fought so far had also possessed it. And yet here, the wounds that should have been child's play to fix still bleed. "You believe I would burden myself with such a useless ability?" he heard Baragan ask. "I have seen many hollows use it, and I have seen you use it. For all its power and its regenerative capabilities, it also burdens any who wield it. They believe they can afford to take hits because they can recover quickly from them. For me, I instead sacrificed it for further power when I became an Arrancar. To push my abilities to their max faster than ever. But I suppose that isn't the only reason," Baragan added, turning his axe around until it pointed towards the ground. "This is why such an ability was useless for me. Rot, ARR-. Baragan's head snapped to the side the moment he sensed the suddenly energy spike, instantly spotting Shinji's form standing on the top of the distant tower. Letting the crackling blue Zero form completely in his hand, Shinji let a brief smirk form on his head as Baragan began to move. "Yep, that's right," he said as he saw Baragan appear to leap backwards. "Gran Ray Zero." As the blast fired, Baragan immediately pushed forward, trying to get closer to Ichigo instead of the way he had been appearing to flee to. Exactly as I expected. Distorting in the air as it flew along its path, Shinji's aim with the unstable blast fell true, heading right towards where he had known Baragan would rush to. Throughout this entire fight, he had seen Baragan rush towards Ichigo often enough to try and harm him, impatiently trying to keep the pressure up. In such a situation, he'd want to use the distance between the two of them first to try and make the Zero miss, and failing that would accept the damage so long as it also slammed into Ichigo too. Unfortunately, Baragan hadn't accounted for Ichigo's own speed. Between the two of them, Ichigo was faster, so there was little chance of the gap between them closing. Which meant this attack was going to hit only one person here. Slamming directly into Baragan as the hollow swung his axe down at the blast, the purple mist at work trying to destroy whatever it could before the rest of the energy could slam into him, the Zero exploded with all the force it had, destroying a good chunk of the roof in the process and covering Baragan with smoke to restrict his vision. Ichigo. Now. Bankai. There was no time to lose. His power spiked before being pulled down and compressed massively. His swords joined together once more to make the single large blade of Tensou Zanjutsu, held back ready to be swung. Before Baragan could recover, before he could release his resurrection, he'd cut him down now. Kicking off at full force from the ground, the roof shattering where he stood, he sped towards Baragan faster than the eye could keep track of and swung, intending to split Baragan in half right as he passed. He felt it the moment he even got close, the weight of something trying to slow him down. But however hard it tried, it was helpless this time round. His blade swung and every alarm bell began ringing in his head the instant he felt Baragan's magical power suddenly spike, one foot slamming against the air so hard he scattered the dust and smoke clouding Baragan's form entirely. Baragan went with it, blown away by the shockwave towards the desert sands close by and off from his palace, but where Baragan had been was the remnants of purple mist, right where he had been about to charge into. Wincing as he felt the pain in his foot from suddenly stopping like that, he gave it a shake for a moment as he glanced from the energy over to where Baragan had been blown away to. It appeared Baragan had tried a similar method to what Ziraf had done in their fights. When facing with speed they can't even hope to match, they settle for a defense that will ignore such speed. Unfortunately for Baragan, he wasn't Ziraf. Ziraf had used that ability to successfully because he had been unable to be killed from any attack, whether it be near or far from him. Baragan meanwhile possessed no such power. If that mist was a permanent feature around him, then he'd fight from range. And if it wasn't, he'd crush him the second an opening appeared. Protector of the Fairies. Bringing both giant arms up in front of his body, Mist-Ogden braced his giant form against the sudden zero that smashed against it. Pieces of the golden giant began to fall apart around him, but he held it together as best as he could, ensuring the integrity of the spell stayed strong. Finally, after what seemed like hours for him when it was only seconds, the zero came to an end and he was free to lower his arms. Only for one of them to be grabbed halfway through that action and used to pull his entire form forward. Still, that wasn't too much of a problem for him. His own balance wasn't the one being affected, and as such he still was able to easily respond in time as a spear was thrown at him. By raising his hand up towards it and giving it up to the blast that consumed it. It was a large waste of magical power, some would say. And they'd be right. But unfortunately he had no choice right now. Stopping the blast like this was one of the only two ways he had to limit the damage. The other was much harder, and involved deflecting the spears by swatting them away before they could detonate. He had done it on occasion, but it was hard enough to pull off the timing on regular attacks. Spears thrown by Ulquiorra were not normal attacks. Rushing to regenerate the giant's missing arm, he pushed off the sand and tried to close the distance between the two of them using his giant's long strides. Ulquiorra was too nimble unless he could hit him with a clean strike, as he had done with his first surprise attack. He had been surprised at just how effective it was. Admittedly he had dropped down from the sky on the hollow with the full force of his giant's size, but he hadn't expected it to crush him into the ground for as long as it did. When Ulquiorra had emerged, one of his arms had been hanging loosely by his side, all the bones broken in it from trying to protect his body. If it wasn't for Ulquiorra's instant regeneration, it would still be like that too. Ever since then, Ulquiorra had made sure to keep his distance for the most part, moving in when he could and using his speed to great effectiveness. His legendary spell, Danga Jiao, was incredibly powerful so long as it could hit. And its durability was strong enough that he could actually stand against Ulquiorra in his current state. But that would only last for so long. Ulquiorra had simply too many powerful attacks that he could use at whim, and was fast enough to dodge all his blows anyway when he did get close. And in a game of magical power, he would lose that too. If he didn't find out a way to hit Ulquiorra again, and this time make sure he stayed down, he'd be done for. The question would be how to keep Ulquiorra in one place long enough for him to be hit. He moved too quickly and certainly didn't close the gap unless he was sure he would be safe. Wait, wasn't that something he could use? Ulquiorra only approached him when he believed he was safe. That was how much he was being wary of his legendary spell. If it could hit, it was actual danger, and so Ulquiorra was only approaching when he was sure he wouldn't be a hit. So if he could trick the hollow into thinking it was safe when it wasn't, he might still have a shot. For the first time in the fight as well, he didn't hear the whispers of Jalal. Whether that was because Jalal agreed with his plan, because he was too busy examining the enemy, or because of some more worrying reason that he didn't want to think about, he was just happy to not have to listen to him right now. So then, what would be enough to fool Ulquira? Taking a swing as fast as he could as he neared the hollow, he had to leap back in his giant form but still caught one of those lances of the hollows against his side. The energy exploded against it, but it was far enough away from him that the blast was moderately contained. It still was getting harder and harder to keep the spell together though, and if he couldn't think of a way to fool Ulquira soon then he'd have no energy left to use. Thinking about it, what if the way to draw Ulquira in was to make him believe he had won? For that to happen in this current situation however, he'd have to take a great risk. He'd have to take a hit from one of those lances directly or from a Ciro Oscuris. If the blast didn't kill him, the pain would make him feel like hell. But surviving one, and keeping his legendary spell with enough strength after that blast, would be the key to fooling and striking Ulquira. But how would he even get the hollow to use the attack? He hadn't so far. I wonder. There was one way he might be able to draw Ulquira into striking. But it would make blocking the attack even harder. Even so, he had to risk it. Pulling his spear off his back, he gripped it tightly within the safety of his legendary spell and allowed a copy of it to form in his giant's own hand. Sacrificing some of the energy from his giant from the legs and back, he pulled it and reshaped it into the large weapon. He'd have to hope Ulquira hadn't noticed those weaker areas, else he'd pay for it dearly. With the spear now in hand, all he needed was to throw it. The energy would align with the path of his physical spear in the process and follow it straight to its target, trading away some of its power for propulsion force to increase its speed. But he would only have one shot. Swiping out and mirroring some of his own thrusts that he would do with the spear without his legendary spell, he kept trying to keep Ulquira back while watching the hollow carefully. When Ulquira next attacked, that would be his moment. The moment he saw the spear being thrown from Ulquira, he leapt back and threw his other hand in front of the blast, letting it get blown away. Now, before Ulquira had time to realize, he had to act. With a sharp throw, he threw the spear forward with all his might. When combined with the physical strength brought on by his legendary spell, it was fast. But it wasn't fast enough. Ulquira was still more than able to dodge out of the way of the giant attack, letting it pass away mere inches from him even though he could have moved away further. But rather than pushing to retaliate, Ulquira had paused for the moment. Why? Was he considering something? Even if he could dodge these strikes, did he still consider it a potential threat? Calling for his spear to return, the weapon darting through the air and barely missing Ulquira as the hollow sidestepped out of the way of the point, he caught it back in his hand before slowly giving up more energy to form a new spear. Taking what he could from the giant without letting anything show, he supplied the rest from his already struggling reserves. That was right. He had to push on like this. Right now, Ulquira was hesitating briefly because he didn't know many of these he could make. The title of legendary spell was enough to make Ulquira double-guess himself for a moment, likely aware himself about how easily some attacks can be reproduced from his own experiences of using them. He just had to make Ulquira focus on that a little bit more, and he'd have him. Pulling his arm back, he prepared to throw the spear once more, Ulquira still not making any moves. And then, right as he was about to release his spear, Ulquira raised a finger towards him. That was it. He could see it now, the black energy tinted with green that was slowly being generated and pulled into a solitary sphere. Ulquira was settling for trying to end this with Ciro Oscuris, and with that happening he still had a chance here. Pulling all the power he could back out of the spear and leaving just enough to maintain its form, he threw the attack forward, just in time to meet Ulquira's own Ciro. He didn't expect for his attack to hold against it for even a moment. Ulquira might have done, but the reason he was using that attack was to end it all right then and there. So instead he focused on pulling all the energy he could and pushing it into the parts of the giant surrounding him while twisting the giant's body so one arm was pulled back away from the blast. It was all useless if he didn't survive this or have a chance to strike afterwards. Bringing his extended arm back in front of his form in the giant, he braced against the blast. That almost became the worst choice he could have ever made when he felt the arm give way almost entirely under a few moments of the beam. With mere moments to act, he tried to redirect the beam just enough that when it broke through it skimmed past his body, destroying the entirety of what remained of his giant's right side. With too much of the giant's structure destroyed, he could barely keep what he had together. Unfortunately, that meant he ended up falling backwards onto the sand, unable to keep his balance or focus on reforming the lost pieces of the giant. Did he still have an arm left? Glancing carefully out of the corner of his eye, he could see the form of it, even if it was lighter than before. It was losing energy fast, and it didn't help that he was hurting from being scrapped by the Blast. It was hurting more than he'd like to admit, so if Ulquiorra didn't take the bait soon then he'd be in trouble. Luckily the sound of Sonido gave him the hope he wanted. Ulquiorra appeared right above him, a lance of that green flame-like energy already held up. It seemed Ulquiorra wasn't going to play around, but then neither was he. Using all the strength he could pull from the giant, he forced the body to move, rolling slightly and using the momentum to add the other arm's physical power as the fist headed straight for Ulquiorra. Only for his last hope to shatter like glass the moment Ulquiorra swung his spear into the fist point first. "So that's it," Ulquiorra said at the sight of the crumbling fist. "So weak it can't even maintain its form from contact with my spear." Turning back towards Mistoggan, he added, "So then, shall we end this charade?" Leaping out of the shell of his legendary spell, Mistoggan tried to back up only to have his head grabbed by Ulquiorra and for him to be thrown across the desert sand. Slamming face first into it, he pushed himself out, coughing up sand, before spinning round and searching wildly for Ulquiorra. His meteor spell burst to life around him, supplying him with as much protection as he could summon with his limited strength, just so it could make some kind of difference. It didn't. He managed to track Ulquiorra as he appeared for just a moment before he had to dodge a spear aimed at his heart in order to save his own life. It shot through the air, barely missing him, only for him to be sent flying again, this time from a kick to his injured side. As he hit the ground once again, his meteor spell flickered and faded. Before he had time to even think, he was back on his feet ready for any attack that might come at him. Only to find a hand gripping him by the throat and squeezing tightly. "Is this all you amount to now?" Ulquiorra asked. "I guess you are nothing but trash." Struggling to breath, he was still able to summon up enough magic as he snapped his fingers. His spear shot towards him from where it had fallen, forcing Ulquiorra to release him to avoid being skewered while he grabbed his weapon. Only for him to be knocked back through the air once again by another blow from Ulquiorra. And this time when he hit the sand, he struggled to get back up at all. Leaning on his spear for support, he glanced up weakly only to find the telltale sign of a Ciro charging up in the distance, ready to obliterate him entirely. This was it, wasn't it? The end. He would laugh if it wasn't so damn frustrating. And it was that reason why he tried to take a step forward anyway, looking inside himself for any extra scrap of power that he could pull free from his body. He wasn't dead yet after all. And so long as he still breathed, he still had a chance. "Except I'll still die," he muttered. "And then you'll move on to the others after me. Ichigo. Taoshiro. Shinji. And then more after that." His grip tightened on his spear before he slowly pulled it free and looked down at his palm. Then, he held it tightly against his chest, just listening to his own heartbeat for a moment. And then everything in front of him changed. No longer was he standing in a desert, under a scorching sun and surrounded by nothing but sand. Instead he was in a void, stretching on for eternity with the flicking of lights surround him in the distance like stars in the sky. The only thing that really appeared solid here was the large stone chair before him, with a single individual chained to it by golden chains. Only his right arm and left leg were unbound, and even the chains themselves looked like they were far more brittle than before. "So you finally came to see me face to face again," Jalal said, leaning back into his throne with the smuggest look on the man's face that he had ever seen. He knew why it was there, of course. It was because he was here before him right now, in a situation where all was hopeless and he had no chance of winning anymore. "So then, are you here to beg for my assistance once again? It'll cut the time you have left as you down even further." "I'm not here to beg," Mistoggan said, raising a hand towards him. For a moment, Jalal raised his eyebrows at the action in interest, as if trying to entice Mistoggan into trying to force him to lend his assistance. only for that expression to slowly turn to confusion when Mistogan's hand came down on one of the chains. I'm here to make a deal with you. In exchange for your freedom. My freedom. For once, Jalal lost his smug attitude, the entirety of his genius mind being focused on Mistogan and looking for any sort of sign that he was bluffing or lying. You're serious here? That I am. I'm more serious about this than anything else in my entire life. Leaning slightly forward, his body straining against the chains binding him, Jalal moved his head so that he was staring directly into Mistogan's eyes. Why? That's odd. I thought you would be relishing at the chance for freedom and control once again. Oh, I am, Jalal shot back immediately. But I've learned a long time ago to be wary of deals that promise everything for nothing. And for you, what you are offering up means losing everything. You've offered this to me countless times before. Jalal scoffed, pulling back and leaning against the stone surface of his chair. Of course I did. But I'm not stupid enough to believe you'd accept. I just needed you to loosen my bonds by accepting me once, and after that you wouldn't be able to ignore my existence again like you managed to for years beforehand. Once you acknowledged me like that, I only had to wait and bide my time while I eroded your own will away and took control back by force. That was how I expected this to go. And then you'd eventually gain control without having to give up anything, Mistogan finished for him. I won't let you do that. And I won't let you refuse my offer either. Because I cannot win right now, but I'm willing to condemn us both the afterlife if stopping one monster means unleashing another. But of course this means presenting a greater risk to your own allies, Jalal pointed out with a smirk. With poor little Ichigo and Shinji stuck fighting Baragan, can they really win if Ulquiorra crashes the party like he is now? That's a risk I'm going to have to take here, Mistogan stated reluctantly. I won't let you go free without something in exchange. Then state your demands. Moving his free arm, Jalal brought it up for his head to rest against. This should be a fun game. Let us see which side breaks first. To see how much each of us are willing to give up for what we want. But I advise you hurry. Even if I'm released, I won't be able to do anything if you take too long. Then I'll be quick, Mistogan shot back. I want your word that you will never harm my friends. Just your friends. Not your allies. You have seen enough of my memories to know who I see as a friend. And I know someone like you would never agree to being tied down by such a large constraint like the one ally would make. Too many people can fall under it. That it would. Agreed. However, I should say that I cannot be held responsible for any harm that occurs to them unintentionally as a result of my actions. Agreed. Very good. Next. You will do everything in your power to help end this war and ensure Ishgar wins. Jalal paused right as he began to open his mouth, running through the words again for a moment with interest before letting a curious glance cross his face. Everything in my power, you say? No other constraints there? You know what I'm capable of, even without my magic. I do. And that's what I want. No matter how dangerous you are, if that monster is used for Ishgar in this war, then it means taking another step closer to victory. And that means another step closer to keeping the people I care about safe. Even if I have to commit atrocities to do so. Mistogan reluctantly nodded. Yes, even if you have to do that. This war must end, before it destroys more than it already has done. Maybe you won't know how to stop it, but someone like you would surely be able to do some damage and push it in the right direction. Interesting, Jalal muttered. So you really are willing to give up quite a lot here in this deal. Agreed. I will ensure the war ends, if only so I'll be able to do as I wish once it's done. Good. One final demand then. I want you to leave Ishgar once all of this is done. Jalal froze, staring at Mistogan in disbelief. What? I want you to leave Ishgar. Permanently. No. Do you want to die? Do you want everyone else to? Mistogan shook his head. No, but even if this war ends, I'm more than aware of the things you might do. And if you cause trouble on Ishgar, you will only end up clashing with my friends. And you will end up trying to kill them to survive, going against your first promise. I won't leave Ishgar. This is my home. Then I want your word you won't do anything that will cause you to clash with my friends. Otherwise just take the chaos you bring to other far-off lands, away from my home. Because if you plan to just be the same monster everyone fears after the war is over, I will let you die here to spare them all from it. I see, Jalal muttered after a few moments. So you would let me go so long as I promise to behave? Is that right? Yes. And what if I've lied? Because you would have done so already, Mistogan replied, an honest smile across his face. For all your words and taunts, you didn't just lie and accept that last promise to make me release you immediately. You are answering my requests with the truth. You're too trusting. Maybe. But right now I have to be. Which is why I believe you are acting so honestly in turn. Gripping the chains, Mistogan softly pulled on them, the links breaking free all around Jalal as he pulled away. I don't know how much you'll honor that last promise, but that will be out of my hands. I simply wanted to see if you truly meant to uphold your word or whether you were agreeing merely to be set free. Slowly leaning out of the stone chair he had been bound to for so long, Jalal took his first step off away from it with almost shaking nervousness. The moment his foot made contact with the ground, the world began to change around them. What was a void slowly began to be filled with color, forming a crystal surface across the ground that extended out around where they both were. Taking another step merely sped up the process, more of the world changing. A sky was appearing before him while the crystal floor managed to reach an end and begin to reveal a large drop-off below. After a few more steps, following by some more confident ones, he reached the edge of the crystal surface and gazed out as the world they were in began to change some more. This is the Tower of Heaven, he muttered, recognizing the tower structure they stood on and the island below. How interesting. Before it was a void filled with nothing but lights to symbolize memories, because that is what I was being recognized as with you in control. But now that I'm free, the void becomes this. The place that lead me to who I am now, with the good and the bad. The place of my childhood and the place where I spent the rest of my life afterwards. It's a horrible place, Mistogan said from beside him, slowly lowering himself to the ground and letting his feet hang off the edge of the tower. A place built from the sacrifices of so many. It is what it is, Jalal responded. My life revolved around this tower for so long. Even I'm not sure of where I'll go from here now that I no longer am chasing after Zeref. For now, this is all I know because it's all I have known. Then go and find a way to make it change, Mistogan muttered back, sighing as he looked at the sight before him. Even if it might appear like a beautiful sight, with this crystal tower in the middle of the sea, I'm not happy about dying here. You wouldn't be happy about dying anywhere. I know. Bringing one leg back up and pulling it against his body, Mistogan buried his head beside it with his arms. I don't want to die. Then you shouldn't have released me. I know. But I still don't want to die. His voice breaking, Mistogan continued with, I'm Mistogan. And I've enjoyed this life, as short as it might have been. Which is why I don't want it to end. You might have been spared this fate if you hadn't followed Ichigo. I wouldn't have had this chance at all if not for him, Mistogan shot back. His body was slowly beginning to glow, parts of it already beginning to scatter and drift towards Jalal himself. I'm thankful for that. Then I'll let him know that, Jalal replied, placing a hand on Mistogan's head. You may not believe me, but I'll pass on those words. I may not like you for keeping me from my body for so long, but in the end you are still me. You were born from my mistakes, and while our paths may have been different I can't quite fault you. You did what you could with the hand you were dealt. For that, I'll grant you this peace. Mistogan chuckled, almost all of his body gone now. You know, if you had been like this from the start, I might have been more willing to acknowledge you. Like I could keep this up forever, Jalal muttered. This is exhausting, being all civil and nice. Reminds me too much of playing the role of Sea Grain. Only with less deception. I would bet, Mistogan replied back, turning up to look at Jalal as the last of his body faded with his last words. Goodbye, Jalal Fernandez. Goodbye Mistogan, Jalal said back, looking at the spot Mistogan had once rested in. Lowering his hand, he took a brief look at the sight before him before sighing. It really is a depressing sight. How odd that in the end this was what we could both fully agree on. And yet only you achieved something beyond this tower that was our life for so long. Chuckling, he added, Is this envy I'm feeling? Perhaps. But I have all the time now to act on that envy and do what I want. Until my life ends. But first I should finish the battle to make sure I can see those days ahead, he muttered, letting his focus drift back to the world waiting for him. Once this battle and this war is over, there won't be any more chains left. I'll finally be free of this place. Like you were. Protector of the fairies. I am thou, and thou art I. Opening his eyes to the world, Jalal took in a deep breath, momentarily ignoring the danger still present in the distance. For even just a few seconds, he wanted to take in these sensations all around him. It was entirely different from when he had been momentarily given control back. Whenever those moments had occurred, he had always felt the chains that bound him trying to pull him back in. Even as they grew weaker, that sensation had never disappeared. That sensation was finally gone now. Nothing was trying to pull him back, and for the first time in forever he was able to truly take in what it meant to live and breathe. Wonderful, he muttered in bliss, even finding joy in the uncomfortable feeling he got from the sand clinging to his body and in the pain his body felt from the punishment it had endured. All of it filled him with joy because it was emotions and feelings he was feeling himself, not seeing from the inside looking out. Everything he saw now would be recorded in his mind as one of his memories. Everything he felt now was directly sensed. There was no more need to watch the memories like a play or examine what Mistogan had felt based on the second-hand emotions of the memories. From now on, it would all be sent directly to him. The increased spiking of magical power forced him to reluctantly focus on the present danger nearby. As much as he wanted to just stand here and take everything in, life was always cruel to him. He wasn't allowed such luxuries just yet, and if he wanted to live longer than these few moments then he would have to work hard to even earn that right. What did he have to work with? Mistogan hadn't left him in a good state, he realized under a brief examination. No serious wounds, something to be happy with he supposed, but his magical power was low. Far too low for him to afford to waste even a single drop. But with as much as he had, it wasn't going to be enough against Ulquiorra realistically. You really do overestimate my abilities, don't you? He muttered. He supposed that Mistogan had simply never considered the fact that he wouldn't be able to win the battle for him. Between the two of them, he was the genius. He was the prodigy. But most of all, he was the one that everyone feared. The idea that he could lose likely never crossed Mistogan's mind. But looking at what he had to work with, he knew he had been in worse situations. Back then both he and his enemies had far less magical power than this, but the sheer difference had been tough to overcome. And he did it anyway, just like he would here. Taking a large chunk of what remained, he poured it straight into his meteor spell and pulled it tightly against his skin. He had told Mistogan how tightening the spell could create far stronger effects, and he intended to put those words into practice here. Rather than a barrier layer, he pulled it so close that it was pressing tightly against his skin like a second layer of flesh. It was as close as he could pull it without causing self-harm, something that would be detrimental to his chances even with the greater boost in power that he would get, but it was enough that he knew there would be a large enough difference in power over Mistogan that Ulquiorra would be caught off guard. That would handle defensive power and mobility. With what little power he had in reserve, he would have to save most of it for emergencies. Now all that was left was offensive power. And luckily he already had an idea on how to cover that. One that he would reluctantly have to give credit to his other self for. This wouldn't have been possible without the magic he learned. Eyeing the dark green light in the distance, he prepared to move and use the Zero as cover. The moment he saw it begin to fire, he leapt up as fast as he could, making it clear out of the way of the blast just before it consumed the area around where he had been standing. He didn't even get a second or two to fly freely in, Ulquiorra on his tail immediately. It was unfortunately that he was still slower than the Hollow, but he was fast enough now to be able to react to the Hollow's movements and make it work with this chase. Continuing to fly upwards, he waited until Ulquiorra was about to grab his leg before immediately darting downwards, dashing past Ulquiorra's face and forcing the Hollow to dodge a slash from the spear he wielded. With his free hand, he grabbed the Hollow's tail and swung it forward as far as he could, sending Ulquiorra straight back towards the ground before darting straight back upwards. That should have bought him a bit more time, he reckoned. Continuing to rush directly upwards, it didn't take him long to sense Ulquiorra closing in one again. To reach his goal, he'd need another distraction realistically. Twisting his spear round, he spun in the air and threw it directly downwards. One of Ulquiorra's hands reached out and grabbed it right before it could hit him, but he used that opportunity to close the gap between them, slamming his feet straight into Ulquiorra's body and knocking him down once again. He doubted he'd get another chance, so he had to hurry now. Reaching the highest point in the sky that he could make it to with the time he had, he raised a hand upwards and let a large magic circle expand from his palm. Then, leaving it hanging in the air as light began to shape in the center above it, he darted straight back down, slamming into Ulquiorra in the process and smashing a fist down at him. He had expected not all of his attacks to connect. His fist had been caught by Ulquiorra's hand before it could make contact, pressure being applied and trying to break through his meteor spell to crush his bones, but before he could let it get that far he quickly snapped the fingers of his other hand, his spear rushing up through the air behind the two of them and forcing Ulquiorra to separate from him to avoid being skewered. He had to avoid a similar fate moments later when a green spear of energy was thrust at his head, deflected with moments to spare with his own spear. The second one was harder to dodge, coming from Ulquiorra's other hand and barely giving him enough time to spin his spear round to knock the blow upwards and scrap past his shoulder. Just the mere contact it had against his meteor spell caused the area to flicker and break, resolving his intentions completely to avoid taking any of those blows head on. In his state, that would mean certain death. Right now, what he needed to do was gain time. Time that would be difficult to grasp away from Ulquiorra but would be greatly worth it if he could succeed. That time too would only be able to be gained if he could get Ulquiorra down near the ground too, to buy himself as much time as possible. Kicking off the air behind him, he launched himself forward and swiped out at Ulquiorra as he reached him. The blow was easily caught against one of Ulquiorra's spears, but that was all he needed to keep Ulquiorra there for a moment, immediately slipping past while the hollow was too focused on defending himself and allowing him to speed down towards the ground. After a few moments, he was forced to glance over his shoulder to work out why Ulquiorra wasn't giving chase. He feared for a moment that his plan had already been discovered, but it hadn't been, much to his relief. Unfortunately, it meant that the reason Ulquiorra had yet to follow him was because he didn't plan to close the distance just yet and was instead pulling back with one of his spears, ready to throw it down at him. He remembered how large the blasts from these spears were. If he could dodge the spear at this height, it would sail down to the ground and would explode harmlessly down there. It might slow him down a bit from reaching the ground until the energy disperses, but it wouldn't be able to harm him at the present moment. The main issue would be dodging it. Ulquiorra threw these spears quickly, and deflecting it might be too risky. Eyeing Ulquiorra's form, he quickly ran through all the actions he was seeing. He took in the strength he had seen so far, the current distance between the two of them and the role gravity would have on the spear's acceleration, the current position of the hollow's arm and what area of his body that the hollow was likely targeting, and then, after analyzing it all, he brought his spear up as if appearing to be willing to take the blow head on. Thinking about it, he doubted Ulquiorra expected him to have considered so much. This stance right now probably spoke of a foolish man's last-ditch effort to fight back, with all their options exhausted. Even the increased speed and strength from his meteor spell could be painted under the same brush. Right now, he was sure Ulquiorra still believed he was the same enemy that he had just been fighting. So he was still using similar tactics and not seeing him as a viable threat anymore due to the disappearance of the legendary spell previously active. Well, he wasn't going to complain, especially in this situation. He had experience playing roles until he could get what he wanted. As the spear was released, he swiftly moved away from its intended target, letting it pass by his side while he kept his eyes on Ulquiorra. He was glad he did when he saw a normal Zero being fired down immediately afterwards, quickly raising his spear up in response and spreading some of his meteor spell across the weapon in order to effortlessly slice through the beam. "Oh? Are you increasing your estimate of Mistogan's threat level?" he muttered, surprised at the appearance of the second attack. "You're more perceptive than I thought." Kicking back off from the air and heading back to the ground, he shot through the fading energy from the spear's blast and let his feet land softly on the ground. A moment later and he was leaping away from where he had landed, a spear being stabbed into the ground where he had stood as Ulquiorra gave chase. To prevent Ulquiorra keeping the advantage, he charged in himself, deflecting and slashing with his own spear against Ulquiorra's two own. He wondered if Mistogin had noticed the effectiveness he had in this battle at close range against this hollow. He doubted it though, what with the sheer difference in speed from before. This was something he could only take advantage of now that he was fast enough to keep up with Ulquiorra, and otherwise would have resulted in him being skewered and burnt at the end of one of those spears of magic. But while those spears were deadly, wielding them like Ulquiorra did with one hand was difficult. They were both the same length, and certainly too large to be accurately wielded repeatedly in battle. They were primarily throwing weapons, and thrusting weapons second. Their size and Ulquiorra's own lack of skill with them meant they were being used like an amateur, exposing more than necessary with each attack and taking way too long to launch the second attack. With his spear meanwhile, he had far more control with the use of both hands. Spinning the spear round to deflect one attack after another wasn't as hard when he could make use of the full length of the weapon with ease. His weapon was also far more stable, which gave him far fewer problems with its usage. With Meteor enhancing its power, he reckoned that he could even destroy Ulquiorra's own spears if he used enough force and targeted them specifically. Not that he would though right now however. The spears of magic were too unstable, with too much magic packed into their weak forms. He only had to see the flame-like appearance they had to know that, seeing the flicking energy for what it was. If anything broke the spear apart and destroyed its weak form, all that energy would rush out. It made dealing with them without destroying them slightly more difficult but not undoable when he was only trying to deflect them away rather than going for them directly. With each clash they did, he analyzed what he could see and how fast Ulquiorra might be able to react. At times he tried to speed up his strikes just to see how fast Ulquiorra would react to them, while other times he would purposefully miss his strikes to test how Ulquiorra would retaliate. Each move was like the movement of a chess piece to him, carefully calculated and all with a larger purpose to the match. As he deflected another thrust from Ulquiorra, he suddenly found the spear he had deflected being discarded, a point-blank zero being formed at the end of one of the hollow's now free and extended fingers. Leaping up, he pulled his body up close to his chest just in time to avoid the zero's blast, the energy skimming across his feet and tearing away the solace of his shoes. Before he could extend his body back out, one of his arms was grabbed and used to slam him straight back down into the ground. Recovering, he rolled out of the way of a spear being thrust downwards, slamming into the sand where his head had been resting. Another zero was being formed in Ulquiorra's hands, so he chose to act before it could be finished, lunging forward and swinging his spear up towards the zero. His own weapon was the one deflected this time, slicing through the edge of Ulquiorra's hand as it passed and causing blood to mix into the zero in the process. He could have sworn if he hadn't thought it would have wasted time. Instead he kicked back off the sand and tried to escape backwards and upwards into the air. A Gran Ray Zero, from the memories he had of seeing it in action, would be something that he would need distance to even have a chance at avoiding. He had no idea if Ulquiorra even had much experience of firing this zero, but he had to assume that he did, in which case he had to work out where it was being aimed. Its distorted path made it hard to tell, but if he was in Ulquiorra's shoes. As the zero fired, he stayed absolutely still. The blast tore through the air, bending and distorting across space before tearing through the air to his left, missing him entirely even as it made a sharp turn and passed his back. Only when it continued on further into the distance before exploding did he let out a sigh of relief. He had hoped that Ulquiorra would have counted on him trying to dodge, and it appeared that such a decision had paid off. Although this was the second major attack now where all he had been able to do was dodge and try and survive. As it stood, he wasn't going to keep this up with so many close calls already. Was his spell done yet? He'd have to take the risk, since keeping this up would tire him out too much and leave him vulnerable. Sending the silent command to the magic circle in the sky, he let it disappear before focusing his full attention on the approaching hollow. So not only Shinji knows that zero, he said as he continued to play the part of Mistogin. Thought it appears you aren't as accurate as he is. The Gran Ray Zero is too obsolete compared to the Zero Oscuras. It one of them is needed, the latter is far more powerful and far more stable than its blood-fueled counterpart. Is that so? What kind of output does that Zero have anyway? Can it destroy a city? A mountain? What's its limit? Such knowledge is irrelevant for you, Ulquiorra replied, raising a finger towards him as a new Zero Oscuras began to form. You will not need any of it a moment from now. Oh really? Slowly pointing up with one hand, Jalal let a smirk grow across his face before adding, you sure you want to ignore that in favor of me though? If you think I'll fall for such. Ulquiorra paused at the increased light coming from above, his shadow growing much longer as he eyed it for a moment. Then, slowly while trying to keep Jalal in one eye's sight, he peered upwards slightly. The action caused him to have to wince and almost close his eyes entirely, the intense rays from the sun above blinding him from looking directly at it. Only for him to realize something was wrong. He didn't remember the sun being that large, or looking like it was that close. He forced his eyes to peer upwards and to not try and look away, staring for just long enough to realize the object above was not the sun. And it was getting closer too. This may hurt. Jalal called over, Ulquiorra's head snapping towards him only to find him gone from where he stood and waving a good distance away, watching the sight too with barely visible amusement. His Zero was still charging, and he could still launch it at his enemy. But at the threat from above, he had little choice but to raise the Zero up and release it at the blinding sphere of light. As the Zero Oscaras tore upwards towards the sphere in the sky, the massive ball of light split straight down the middle, the energy that made it up parting and becoming like rivers of water as they continued to spread downwards, avoiding the destructive blast released at them. The light slammed down around the hollow, and Ulquiorra prepared himself for the pain that was sure to follow only to find nothing hurting him. Instead, the light that had slammed into the ground around him continued to move, being drawn past him all the way to where Jalal stood in the distance, one hand raised forward as light began to gather in the shape of a miniature sphere. Who are you? Ulquiorra asked, looking away from the light to focus on Jalal himself. Who am I? Can't you tell? No. Your actions have begun to differ far too much from the man I have been tasked with eliminating. Your increase in speed and strength could have been dismissed, as could a last wind of energy. But the man I was fighting didn't have eyes like yours, or that expression you are wearing right now. Who are you? Oh, so the game's already up, is it? Continuing to smirk, Jalal added, my name is Jalal. Jalal Fernandez. I was a wizard saint and a previous member of the Magic Council 7 years ago, before we clashed on some ideological issues. I wanted to revive a dead god. They didn't want me to. You can guess how it went. You are meant to be dead. Am I? Stabbing his spear into the ground, Jalal let go of it to point at himself. I can assure you, I'm 100% real. My mind's been resting for a long time, but it's finally back. And you, dear Hollow, are the one chosen to be the first casualty to my goals. You should consider yourself Yuri not listening, are you? Two minds, Ulquiorra muttered, looking at him with what he swore was interest or curiosity. Two distinct personalities. What does this mean for your heart in this case? Starkey and Lilynet were split souls, but where does the heart lie for those with split personalities? If the heart people talk about is not physical, then does this mean both you and the man before you possess one each? You never do shut up about hearts, do you? Jalal asked in annoyance. If you want to know so badly, then come here and try to rip mine out. I promise you, it won't be easy. Ulquiorra shook his head at the response. I am no fool. You are not trash, even if your level of power right now suggests as such. What is that orb? What are you planning? You really think I'll tell you? Jalal chuckled. What the hell, I'm being generous. And I don't need to buy time any longer, so I guess it's fine for me to show off a bit. My other self, you see, he really liked light make magic. Learned a whole ton of it and even made a legendary spell out of it. And as much as it might hurt my own pride, I'm not nearly as skilled in that area yet. But doing the basics like gathering the element, oh that I can do. Tapping the orb of light still expanding above his hand, new spheres also being formed to keep the size manageable around him, he continued by adding, you see all of this here? You wasted your Zero firing at it when it was coming crashing down on you because the only threat it had to you was from the physical force of it falling. Magically, it doesn't have much to it. That's the beauty of molding magic though. The magic is used to shape objects, while their strength is enhanced by the magic running through them and the shapes they take. You prepared a spell to gather light while you distracted me below, Ulquiorra stated, coming the conclusion Jalal was leading towards. With such little magical power left inside you, you sought out anything to compensate. How pathetic. You're still clinging to life that much that you'd crawl around for any scraps left. Jalal shrugged. Insult me if you will, but I waited years to come back. If you think I feel any shame from your words, you'd be sadly mistaken. Flicking the sphere above his palm up, he let it float around him until there were 7 large, equally sized spheres floating in the area behind him. Shall we see who wins then? The pathetic man clinging to life as you might put it, or the hollow who already gave up on it? Personally, I'd put money on the former. The odds are better. With a snap of his fingers, he took all the light of one of the 7 orbs and reshaped it as he charged, creating 10 large blades of light and firing them past him. Being forced to deflect the blows quickly with his spears left Ulquiorra vulnerable as Jalal lunged at him, being forced to retreat back to avoid the thrust of the spear. With another snap of his fingers, Jalal took the blades and reshaped them again around Ulquiorra, forming small orbs that each released a large blast of light as a beam. Swinging up one spear rapidly, Ulquiorra tried to slice through the attack only for it do nothing but split the beam without halting it, the light slamming into him. It didn't hurt him though, he immediately realized. All it did was block his vision entirely, causing him to realize the mistake he had made in seeing them as a threat. Spinning back towards where he could sense Jalal, he swung his spear out in warning only for it to meet no resistance as it swung through the air. As the light began to fade, he got a brief glimpse of vision at Jalal as a spear was thrust towards him, forcing him to hastily try and dart to the side out of the weapon's reach. The light served its purpose well though. By the time he had been able to see the attack and move, it was too late to avoid it entirely. The spear might have missed his chest, but it instead found itself buried in his shoulder, stuck deep in there until Jalal ripped it free and left his arm hanging there by small bits of flesh. His instant regeneration kicked in immediately, but Jalal didn't intend to wait for the wound to heal, pouncing on the opportunity he had made. Keeping his attacks heavily focused on Ulquiorra's right, he stabbed out repeatedly, forcing Ulquiorra onto the defensive with his one unwieldy spear and chipping away at any flesh that was regenerated. With a smirk, he snapped his fingers briefly again as they broke free of the blinding field of light, the beams coming to a stop and being reshaped and being joined by another of the original 7 spheres. Forming together, they gathered and reshaped until a massive axe hovered in the air, the end of the hilt held out in Jalal's path. Stabbing the spear forward once more, he dug it deep into Ulquiorra's shoulder and left it there to block the regeneration. Then, grabbing the end of the axe as he dodged the blow of retaliation from Ulquiorra, he swung forward with the oversized weapon. Raising a spear up in defense, Ulquiorra braced against the blow before it began to dig into the unstable weapon. Without giving any of them time to react, the spear's energy detonated under the force, blowing away the entirety of the weapon and slamming into the 2 of them. Both weathered through the blast, Ulquiorra due to his own resistance to his attacks and Jalal due to a combination of his meteor spell providing protection and the axe of light taking the full brunt of the damage. Which was also entirely what he had counted on. Closing the gap that had been made between the 2 of them, he summoned up his spear as he moved and had it rip itself out of Ulquiorra's shoulder, tearing away the entire army in the process as it spun and shot towards him. Catching it just midway between the 2 of them, already seeing Ulquiorra's instant regeneration trying to work, he reapplying the coat of meteor around the spear before stabbing it forward at Ulquiorra's now exposed head, no spears left to deflect the blow with. He didn't expect for Ulquiorra to raise his hand and catch the spear in it. Well, he supposed saying Ulquiorra was catching it was being generous. In reality his spear had completely pierced the hollow's hand and was sticking out a good chunk too, almost reaching the hollow's head. But it was stopped by the flesh, keeping his spear from advancing any further without more force. Before he had the chance to push further, Ulquiorra raised a still-forming arm and slammed the fist against his chest, sending him flying back as his spear was forcibly ripped from his grasp. With a snap of his fingers, he redirected the light that had broken away Ulquiorra to reform into chains, trying to wrap around the hollow and buy himself some time. With a silent command his spear was being called back to him, tearing its way out of the hollow's hand, but before it reached him he could already see the dark green glow of a Ciro Oscar as charging where Ulquiorra stood. The chains around him weren't even keeping him contained, struggling and failing to keep the hollow's arm from moving to aim. Knowing he still needed time to finish recovering, he redirected 3 of the other spears of light towards him and reshaped the light, creating layer after layer in front of him of light barriers. They wouldn't last long against the Zero, they just didn't have anywhere near enough power to hold against the destructive beam, but he would only need them all to hold long enough to give him an extra few seconds. Halting his current momentum from where he had been flung, he saw the last of his barriers form as the Zero fired, immediately shooting upwards in a hope to make it out of the way of the blast. His barriers however broke far faster than he had anticipated, and while he avoided the epic entree of the blast he was still caught in its edge. He made it out a moment later, but he could feel his meteor spell flickering from the massive strain it had been put under to try and protect him. And then the worst happened. It faded entirely. It was only for a moment, but in that brief moment he felt like it lasted for hours as he began to fall. It flickered back to life right before he fell back into the Zero Oscars below, something that would have surely killed him without the protection of his spell, but before he could recover he was being grabbed by Ulquiorra and thrown down anyway. If the Zero had still been powered, he was sure that might have been the end. Luckily for him, it was only the lingering energy left that Ulquiorra had managed to outrun and throw him into it. But it still caused his meteor spell to flicker more. Rolling out of the way quickly as a spear slammed into where he had been, he called his own back only for it to be deflected just as it was about to reach him and knocked to the ground away from him. Another call to it was bringing it towards him, but first he had to avoid the blows that Ulquiorra was throwing at him in retaliation from his previous attacks. It was odd. Was Ulquiorra getting faster? The weight of those thoughts hit him like a ton of bricks as he realized what he was seeing. It wasn't that Ulquiorra was getting faster, but rather he was getting slower. After taking the last few hits and having his meteor spell fade for a moment, he must have lost a lot of the energy he had been using to maintain it. And even though he was keeping it as close to his body as before, he had less magic coursing through it and enhancing his abilities. He knew this wasn't good. Molding the light he had gathered was fairly easy, even with such small amounts of magical power left. So long as the element was there, he could still reshape it so long as he wasn't creating any extra light. That was where the real drain would come from. But the light constructs that he could make simply lacked the true strength necessary to match Ulquiorra's own raw power. That was why he needed them to assist him and use his meteor spell to give himself the speed and strength to fight close up, using the spear to deal the critical blows. If his speed dropped now, he'd be in trouble. Without it, he wouldn't stand a chance. He couldn't afford to become any slower now, so against his better judgment he slowly began to tighten his meteor spell further. He felt the pain briefly as it began to dig into his skin, burning away the skin in many areas across his body and causing blood to leak from the wounds caused, slowly dyeing the golden light he was surrounded with into a dark red. Doing this for long was going to be dangerous, and he would lose far too much blood if he didn't wrap up his wounds after he was done. But he needed more speed now to make up for what he lost. Grabbing his spear as he backed away to give it space to return to him, he snapped his fingers once more and drew in the light from the 3 spheres that had made up the many barriers he had made. The energy began to circle them both, forming hundreds of small arrows all aimed down at Ulquiorra and the area around him. All it would take was one spear, thrust down at the ground and having its energy unleashed, to blow all those attacks away. It was the obvious course of action, so it meant he couldn't let Ulquiorra do it. Despite the risk to himself, he charged in as he began to fire the arrows, knocking the spear that was being aimed at the ground back up and then releasing one hand from his spear to slam it into Ulquiorra's face. Disorientating the hollow didn't give him much time, but it was long enough for all the arrows to reach their targets. Bracing against the blows of light that slammed into his meteor spell, he did his best to endure it as he brought his spear back around and thrust at the hollow before him. Ulquiorra recovered in time to deflect the attack with one of his own spears before retaliating in kind, the spear scrapping across his side as it passed. With Ulquiorra slightly overextended, he briefly released his grip entirely on the spear and closed the distance more, slamming his fist into Ulquiorra's face once again and releasing some of the precious magical power he had left to send him crashing down against the ground. The arrows weren't doing much, he bet, likely acting as a dull pain, but he hoped it was enough of a distraction for the moment. His spear was already being summoned back to his hand as he began to stab forward without it, catching it mid-thrust and trying to pin Ulquiorra to the ground with it. A leg slammed into his chest before his attack could reach its target, however, knocking him up into the air away from the hollow. In a last-ditch effort to carry through with his attack, Jalal threw his spear forward, the spear accelerating towards its target only to get deflected at the last moment as Ulquiorra tore through the barrage of light arrows, one of his own spears being thrown afterwards in response. Darting down towards Ulquiorra, he rolled in the air out of the way of the spear, letting it explode harmlessly in the distance away from him, as his spear began to rush up from behind Ulquiorra towards him. He knew it wouldn't reach him in time however, and neither would the light below, so he was forced to quickly expend a bit more of his remaining magic to create a magic circle before him, firing down a blast of heavenly body magic. While much stronger than the light make magic he had been using, it still wasn't enough. Ulquiorra didn't even take the chance of it being a beam intended to blind him, treating it as a serious attack and slashing through the beam before it could reach him. He managed to avoid the spear swung at his head as they neared one another but was unable to avoid the arm that grabbed onto his hand, throwing him straight down into the path of his own spear. Without much time to think, he cancelled his call to the spear and forced his way out of its path with his meteor spell, grabbing it as he passed and avoiding himself from being skewered. He then had to try and halt his momentum as he fell, trying to regain some semblance of mobility only for Ulquiorra to slam into him, sending him crashing into the sand below. Groaning as he pushed himself up onto his feet, leaning on his spear for support, he glared up at the hollow only to suddenly find it before him, its tail wrapped around his throat before he had time to react. Pulling him up, he felt himself hanging there in the air, the tail trying to squeeze its way through his meteor spell and choke him out. And with how much pressure it was applying around his throat, it likely would in a few moments if he didn't do something. He tried to raise his spear only for Ulquiorra to rip it from his hands and throw it to one side. He tried to shape some of the nearby light but there wasn't enough nearby that he could easily gather. He could probably cast about one more heavenly body spell if he tried but he knew it wouldn't be enough to make the hollow release its grip. With victory right in its sight, nothing would stop it now. What options did he have left? Almost no magical power left meant no spells strong enough to help. A flickering meteor spell meant he was close to losing the physical boosts it was granting him. His spear was too far away and would only be deflected if called. The light nearby was too far away and too weak to break him free, and he was even having problems sensing his connection to it right now. Was this it? After all this time, was he only going to have the time he had spent fighting here as his moments of freedom before being killed? After waiting all this time, after being so patient, was this it? That wasn't fair. He didn't do all of this just to die straight afterwards. There had to be something left. Some other trick up his sleeve. Think. What could he use? What weakness could he exploit? Until he stopped breathing, he still had a chance. He survived the Tower of Heaven's destruction by clinging to life, and had survived being trapped inside his own mind by clinging to his own sense of self. He wasn't going to stop trying to claw his way out of death just because the situation was hopeless. He just needed a single chance, and he had to hurry. His vision was already beginning to fade, turning black as the pressure around his neck increased. Just one more chance. Suddenly the pressure around his neck vanished and he could see clearly again, barely managing to land solidly on his feet as he was released. At the suddenly disappearance of Ulquiorra though, he knew it wasn't the hollow's actions that had spared him either. Glancing at the large amount of light that had taken shape beside him, a fist of light where Ulquiorra had been standing, he looked up in awe and shock at the sight of the construct still forming before him. And then he laughed. Laughed at the giant of light before him, broken chains dangling around its limbs. "So I'm not the only one who clings to life so strongly," he said, speaking up to the giant in amusement. "Is that you, Mr. Ogden?" No response came. Was he expecting one? He wasn't sure really. He had seen the man fade away inside his mind, but he also remembered the light the man had broken down into drifting into him. Mr. Ogden had surely disappeared, but perhaps the man's will still remained within him. It lingered within his soul and within his magic, perhaps not fully conscious of its own identity but there nonetheless. It must have answered his call to live. It must have gathered up all the light from the 7 original orbs and used it to shape its form. But without heavenly body magic coursing through it, and with only that much light fueling it, it was still weak. But he could work with that. An idea was slowly beginning to form in his mind. If the legendary spell was fueled by both of their 2 magic, then there was a good chance that it had some similarities to his meteor spell. He didn't have much magic left, probably only enough to keep himself going for another minute, but it was worth trying. Raising himself towards the giant's chest, he parted the light around it and stepped into the center of the being. Using all the magic he had left, he let it spread throughout the giant, enhancing its power and bringing it closer to its true strength. He could tell some magic was already being to escape, so before more could he gripped every last drop of the giant's shape and pulled it closer. If it shared a connection with the way his meteor spell worked, then it likely could also be condensed down for greater power. Mistoggen would never have been capable of doing this, but then he would never have been capable of making this giant without many years of practice. Even if he had the memories, the technique and control behind it was something born through countless years of experimentation and practice. But together, with the two of them working like this, they could do what neither could alone. Bringing the light as close as he could bring it, he tightened it around him until it concealed his original form entirely, leaving a human-sized version of the giant in his place, made up from the condensed light around him. Now where was Ulquiorra? He didn't have long to act, and the strain of keeping the light in place was immense. If he loosened his grip for even a moment, he was sure it would all spring back out and the form of the giant would crumble entirely. There. The hollow had been knocked a decent distance away by the blow but hadn't made any moves to get closer. Ulquiorra must have been wary of the fact the legendary spell was now back in play and was playing it safe instead. If he was in the hollow's shoes, he would be using one of those energy spears to finish him off at a distance. Which meant he had to beat him to it. His spear flew to his hands and he almost missed his timing to catch it, shocked by the massive increase in speed his arm moved at. At this point, he wasn't even able to keep track of his movements, his body moving faster than his mind could keep up in this enhanced state. He had to move slowly. Carefully restraining himself, he brought his spear up into position. One throw. That was all he needed, with all the physical strength he could push into the spear being launched at Ulquiorra. If he missed, it would all be over. He wouldn't be able to maintain this form for longer than 20 more seconds, he reckoned. But that was enough time. This victory is due to both of us, he muttered, aiming the spear carefully with his arm held back. Even I can't deny that, Mistoggen. So, let's finish this as one. Orion. Throwing the spear forward with everything he had, with all the energy he had being poured into the energy that coated the weapon, it vanished from his hand entirely to his eyes, becoming nothing more than a beam of light that tore towards Ulquiorra in the distance. It collided with an already throw spear mid-flight only to tear right through the explosion caused, Ulquiorra only having time to blink at the sight before the spear slammed straight through his chest and released its energy inside his body, the blast spreading out and consuming the hollow entirely as a massive ball of light lit up the sky where he stood. The armor around Jelal snapped away from him and broke away into light as he watched, his meteor spell also fading as the last drops of magic he had left faded from his system. There wasn't even enough to call for his spear, but that didn't matter right now. Instead he just let himself fall onto his back, letting himself rest as all the strain from the fight hit him at once. Well, we won, he muttered, feeling a small trail of the light he had used still present around his arm. He glanced up at it briefly, almost imagining the form of Mistoggen standing there for a moment. Don't worry, I'll keep my promises, he muttered as it faded. I see what you did now, he added, noticing emotions he wasn't familiar with feeling towards certain individuals. You didn't vanish. You became a part of me. We are one and the same now. Your experiences are now mine, as are your connections. Frowning, he realized he was beginning to smile. I suppose you'll have to make to do with this. In the end, we'll both get what we want. As long as I live, I won't surrender my freedom again. And as long as you are a part of me, maybe that will help me find the path I'm looking for now. What do you say? Partners. He chuckled at the lack of response. I'll take your silence as a yes. I'll have to now. But I think I will be able to tell what you would want from now on. After all, am I you and you are me? From now on, there is only one person here, and he is the two of them us together. So we'll both just have to accept that, I reckon. Slowly pushing himself back up to a sitting position, he glanced at his wounds before beginning to tear away some of his clothes to bandage them. Well then, let's get going. We can't keep standing out here forever. And besides, I have a promise to keep to you after all. Let's go, Miss Doggin. Let's go and meet or rather our, friends. Protector of the fairies. The child that desired love. Again. You needn't worry so much, Nozomi said, looking up from her book as Ichigo entered the room. A bouquet of brightly colored flowers rested in one of his hands while an awkward smile was forced across his face. I can't help it, Ichigo said as he crossed over to her, stopping at the vase on the cabinet beside her and swapping out the flowers present. Discarding the others to a nearby bin, he glanced back to her before adding, "You've been getting worse recently. I'm worried." Nozomi simply smiled back at him, slowly closing her book and resting it on the cabinet beside her. "I'm fine," she said in reassurance, not that she expected it would do much good. Not when she was saying this from a bed she had been stuck in for quite some time now. "I'm sure I'll be up and about soon." "You've been saying that for weeks," Ichigo muttered, clenching his fists tightly behind his back in his frustration. "I'll try and get another doctor. Laxus has more connections than I do. He must know someone who can do something. If we knew where Wendy was." "Damn it. Still no word about her." Ichigo shook his head. "Nothing in years. Not since people started to realize she possessed Nirvana and the frightening control she was gaining over it. She never even said goodbye to anyone before she vanished, not even leaving a note or anything, so who knows where she is or what she's up to. I doubt she'd even come out of hiding if she did get the message." "She would for you." "That's not a good thing," Ichigo muttered. "Remember what happened with Kelia and Waiwak? God knows what changes might have occurred in Wendy as a result of either her isolation or Nirvana itself, and her not being a danger to me is not the same as not being a danger in itself if she's only driven by blind obsession. But whether or not we can even find her is not the issue here. You can't just keep treating this all so lightly." "I'm not going to die from this, Ichigo," Nozomi said softly to him, getting only a broken look in return. "You don't believe me, do you? You keep getting weaker. Every passing day, more of your strength leaves you. Food isn't giving you enough energy, medicine isn't doing the trick, and no magical means have helped one bit so far. I'm watching you wither away before my eyes, holding the power to destroy this world and yet not even able to use a single bit of it to save you. How are the kids taking it?" Ichigo sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Yuato and Ryoji are starting to pick up on things. I tried to keep them distracted as best as I could, to keep them focused on other stuff, but they're noticing how much you stay in bed nowadays. They've asked quite a few times when you'll be able to play more with them. And Shizuku? She knows. You told her?" Ichigo shook his head. "She's perceptive." "Got that from you really? I don't know how much she knows or how serious she believes it is, but..." He sighed again, glancing at Nozomi uncertainly. "I'm not sure what to do really. She's been staying out later than ever and I've had to go bring her back quite a few times now. I think she's afraid to come home and see you. She probably fears the same as I do and is trying to run away from it." "No child would want to watch their mother wither away," Nozomi muttered softly. "If you really can't find a cure dash." "Don't say that. If you can't," Nozomi stressed, "then make sure to keep a close eye on her. I'm afraid of what might happen to her if I die." "You think she'll become like me?" "I don't mean it like that." Ichigo nodded. "It's fine. I wouldn't want that either. If she tried to run away from the pain, I'll do my best to bring her home again. Maybe that would have worked out better for me really. Regardless, I won't let her suffer alone. I won't let any of our kids do so. And you'll look after yourself, right?" she asked, getting no response in return. Ichigo. I'll do my best. For at least a few decades, all right. After that, I can't promise anything." "Ichigo. I can't help it," Ichigo muttered back brokenly. "Seeing you withering away like this is bad enough. But then I look in the mirror and see myself. Unaging. Unchanging. And then I remember how quickly the kids have grown, and I feel nothing but fear. Fear that one day I'll be watching the same thing occur again, only with them in your place. And there I'll be, still looking the same as today and every day before that. I suppose it would be unfair of me to ask any more then." Unfair. Ichigo shook his head. Never if it's you. If it would make you happy, I would do it even through that pain. Even if you die and I live on, I don't intend to forget our vows. I once told you that I'll do anything for you if you asked for it with all your heart, and that hasn't changed once. You could ask me to live on for centuries, protecting any descendants we might have, and I would do it. But would you be happy like that? She got no response. You don't know her? Then at the very least promise me if I do die, you'll do your best to find things to keep making you happy. Don't cut yourself off entirely like I know you will want to do because it will make the pain more bearable, because then all you'll have is pain. I promise, Ichigo said, resting a hand over hers for a moment before slowly retreating back to the doorway. Get some rest, alright? I'll check on the twins and then go and pick up Shizuku. It's been getting darker recently and I don't feel comfortable leaving her out there for any longer than this. I'll be back soon, alright? I'll be waiting, Nozomi replied softly, slowly reaching back for her book as the door closed behind Ichigo. It was heavier than its weight might appear in her hands, and she knew it was because she was having more and more trouble with summoning up her strength recently. Resting it against her lap, she turned back to her point in the story before letting herself get engrossed in it to pass the time. After only a few pages though, she knew she was too distracted to keep reading when she realized she hardly remembered what was happening. She just couldn't help it though. Thoughts and worries about her situation just kept coming back to her, until eventually she moved her book back away and laid back into her bed, pulling the covers tightly around her and over her head. Even that though didn't help her with her worries. Everything around her still acted like a loud drum in her mind, not giving her any peace of mind. Not able to take it anymore, she warped the space around her and let herself fall into her own dimension, embracing the silence of the lifeless world around her as the rip in space closed behind her. Here she wouldn't be disturbed. Here, she could rest peacefully. Nothing could distract her here. There was no wind to flow through the sky or life that lived to make sounds. It was just her and the void that surrounded her, with the only other objects present being what she had stored in the past. Floating through the void, she grabbed a small bag of crisps from her left before moving towards where a bottle of water rested, sealed tightly in a plastic container. Taking a small bit from one of the crisps, she followed it up with a few sips of the water, feeling a little bit of her strength returning. The food out there did nothing, and ever since she had started feeling weak, this is what she had been reduced to using. This stuff had been stored in here ever since the outbreak of the war across Ishgar. Replaced every once in a while, they served a singular purpose. To provide emergency supplies in case problems arose and she found herself unable to return home. She hadn't quite expected to use them at a time like this though, or even to find random items she had thrown in and forgotten about over the years. Taking a few more bites from the crisps, she took another sip of the water only to find little came out this time. Glancing at the bottle and giving it a few shakes, she let out a sigh as she realized it was empty before discarding it over towards where she had thrown the others to in her past trips here. That was the last one she had, unfortunately. She didn't have any more of that water left, and she had perhaps another small bag or two of old rations that wouldn't last much longer. Dropping the still unfinished bag of crisps and letting it float there, she began to drift more around her dimension while letting her thoughts wander. She felt a little bit stronger again, but that would fade within a few hours, she reckoned. Another few days and she'd likely be dead. Such a thought didn't fill her with dread though. Instead she merely focused on what she could do until then. There was still some time left. But for the most part, her options were fairly limited. With another wave of her hand, she let herself drift and fall out of her dimension, landing softly on her feet out in the park she knew Shizuka would be in. Ichigo would already be on his way and would likely start panicking upon seeing her, stressing how using magic in her state was dangerous, but she could put up with that later. First, she had someone she wanted to speak to. "I know you're there," she called out, glancing over at where she could see a foot peeking out from the owner's hiding spot. "Shizuku, come on out." Shizuku poked her head out on her mother's command with a conflicted look on her face. "You shouldn't be out of bed, Mum. And you should be getting home. It's later than ever with you right now. Though I might have been more willing to make allowances if you came home more and spent some time with me. Did I do something to upset you?" "That's not it," Shizuku exclaimed, looking directly at Nozomi before glancing away as she took in her mother's form and state. Are you going to get better? Of course I will. I listen sometimes, Shizuku muttered, ignoring Nozomi's words. When I think you and Dad won't notice, or when Dad's talking to one of the different doctors or mages he brings over. Nothing works on you. I'll be fine soon. Trust me. You do, don't you? Shizuku nodded weakly. I do. Just, please don't die. Please. I won't, Nozomi said, opening her arms out before her daughter ran straight into them. There, she whispered softly, clutching Shizuku tightly to her. A frown briefly crossed her face before she hid it away before Shizuku could notice as she pulled away. Come on then. Let's go home. Together. Shizuku nodded as she took her mother's hand, letting herself be led away. All the while, Yukio watched on from the distance with a frown across his face. What are you up to, Nozomi? He muttered, resting his arms against each other in thought. What have you noticed? Protector of the fairies. She could hear it. The sound of footsteps, moving across the floor of her room. It wasn't any of the kids, the door was still closed, and since Ichigo tended to spend most of his time awake looking into other methods to help treat her when she slept, the light still on from under the door meant he was still there working. Whoever it was, they had come in through the window or just passed through the wall. Either was really possible with the world she lived in. Now how best to respond without giving away that she was awake? The covers were still tightly pulled around her, which meant it would be hard for the intruder to realize she was waiting for them unless she made any large obvious movements. How far were they? They sounded close, but still sounded like they were trying to be quiet. And yet those attempts made the sound louder to her trained ears. They were almost within striking distance. Hearing that final step needed to be taken, she rolled over suddenly towards the intruder, kicking the blankets up to obscure their vision. With the chance she had, she slipped straight into her own dimension before coming back out behind her intruder, still distracted by the covers thrown up at him. The familiar feeling of her weapon fell into her hand as she reappeared, the need for it reaffirmed by the presence of a knife in the intruder's grip, and with a quick swing she had the flat side of the blade impacting against the intruder's head. Whether it was her usage of magical power that alerted Ichigo to the uninvited guest or the sound made by that hit, it didn't matter in the end because he still turned up in time to see him hit the ground. She had forgotten how fast he could be when he needed to be, and for a brief moment she saw what she had expected to see on his face. Nozomi. Are you alright? There was the panic now. He was already checking her over for any injuries, ignoring her attempts to calm him down, before his gaze turned towards the intruder knocked out cold on their floor. How did he even get in here? Was he after you? If he was, it was probably to hurt you, she stated, crouching down and eyeing the man in question. The man was tall, even when crumbled over like this, with well-kept blonde hair and dressed in a suit that she was sure cost more than the house they lived in. Did you do anything to annoy any rich idiots over the years to have them come and try and kill me personally? Or do you think they are just someone foolish and arrogant looking to further their own reputation with the public by hurting you? I've never seen him before, so maybe the latter. Ichigo frowned as he looked the man over before glancing towards the open window. I'm going to go check around the area. See if anything looks suspicious. Could you check on the kids for me? I can sense Shizuku in her room, but I've never been good at sensing the boy's magical power. It tends to get submerged by Shizuku's and isn't high enough for me to detect even when they are separate from her. I'll check things here. Hurry up and go. Turning away as Ichigo climbed out the window, she quickly hurried to each of the bedrooms nearby. Glancing into Shizuku's quietly, she could see the girl faintly in the darkness, fast asleep in her bed. Satisfied there, she quickly moved to room the twins shared before stepping in the moment she saw the door slightly askew. The window was open here. And what made things worse was the fact that the twins were missing, their beds empty with no sign of them being close by. Ryoji? Yuato? She had to try at least, but no response came in response. She couldn't really pick them up on her senses either, but one thing was clear to her. They weren't here. The place looks clear, she heard Ichigo say from behind her, glancing around suspiciously at the room as she turned to face him. I gave it a few looks over but nothing stood out. That was fast. Are you sure you didn't miss anything? I'm starting to wonder that, Ichigo muttered as he glanced at the twins' room. Doesn't look like a struggle took place here. More like whoever broke in just grabbed the kids and took off running. Though I don't see any signs of that from the outside. Some kind of teleportation magic perhaps. Do you think you'll be able to track them down at all? I'll find something. Give me a few more minutes and I might be able to even pinpoint their positions. Do you think you'll be alright here? I'll be going with you. Out of the question, Ichigo responded with immediately. In case you forgot, you're weak. You struggle to hold a book on some days, don't lie because I've seen you do it, so I know what kind of condition you're in. You aren't in any position to fight anyone. I'm not letting you go in alone. But if you think it's a good idea to leave your sick wife home with your untrained daughter while there's still trouble around. Alright. Wake up Shizuku too then. But just promise me you'll stay close to me and that you'll stress the same to her. Just because it might be safer with me, doesn't mean it is a safe place. Protector of the fairies. Is this all of them? Nozomi asked, poking one of the unconscious men curiously as if it might cause them to reveal something. They can't have honestly thought this many men would have been enough considering your reputation. Idiots are idiots, Ichigo simply responded with, glancing around suspiciously himself for any signs of traps. Shizuka was the only one not worried out of the two of them, with the twins currently latched onto her while their parents searched the place. It appears this was it luckily. So what do we do with them? Report them to the Magic Council. Only thing we can do that won't cause more problems. Byakuya might be able to use this to dig up who was behind this or whether or not it was merely an isolated event. Best to be sure after all. I can probably do some digging of my own. If we can identify them properly, it'll be fairly easy for me to infiltrate their homes and see if they were planning anything more. Not until you've recovered Nozomi. Yeah, I know. Standing back up and backing away from the body she was by, she opened her arms towards the twins as Yuuto ran towards her, embracing him like her life depended on it. Ryoji meanwhile had rushed towards his father's arms, being picked up the moment he reached him. Are you alright? She asked to Yuuto, smiling as he clung to her tighter and gave a small yes in response. That's good. Ichigo, how's Ryoji? He's fine, Ichigo called over, holding the boy close to his chest. Aren't you Ryoji? I'm fine. Ichigo, would you mind checking the area once more? Nozomi asked, taking Yuuto's hand as she moved towards her husband. I'll watch over the kids for the moment while you do so. Ichigo hesitated for a moment before slowly lowering Ryoji to the ground and letting him run over to his mother. I'll just be a minute or two. If you feel even the slightest bit of danger, call for me. I'll be there in an instant. We'll be fine. Go ahead and go. Pausing for a moment as he was about to leave, Ichigo stopped and took a long look at her. What is it? I don't know. It's just. It feels like this is farewell for some reason. You're imagining things. Probably. Still. Call me if anything happens. It doesn't matter if it's only the sound of a mouse or a bird's cry, just call me. It'll be fine, but if it'll reassure you then I will. Now go on. Happy with her response, Ichigo took off, leaving her alone with the kids. Shizuka still stood in the same place that she had stood since the fighting had initially begun, far enough away from all the bodies as if she was afraid they would awaken at once and jump her. Shizuku, are you okay? It's just. Fighting is quite an ugly thing, isn't it? She said, seeing the problems that her daughter was having at the scene around her. Unlike herself and Ichigo, Shizuka had never seen conflict before at this point in her life. It wasn't a sight that was second nature to her, and it appeared she was having problems coping with it. I envy you, I suppose, for seeing things in that way. For me, I had to adjust to the reality of it in my old world. Shizuka glancing at her curiously, her worries seeming to vanish at those words. Your old world? I suppose I've never really mentioned it, have I? I came from a place called Edalis. It had some similarities to Earthland, though at its core it was a world without magic tied to it. The only magic that resided there was stolen and diminishing rapidly, so conflict over the precious resource was like second nature to the people of that world. It made things difficult for me during those early years too, since I was born a bit differently than most. Differently. Nozomi nodded. I could manipulate the magic in the air to a small degree. It let me connect to a separate dimension. I wasn't the only one like this, mind you. My old friends there could do similar things. One of us could create ice, the other could store items they liked in their own personal space, one of us could manipulate memories, one of us could create concentrates forces of energy, and one of us could reach out and bring an army of empty beings into the world. I suppose we could be considered the mages of that world due to that rare ability. And then there was the king whose ability to control magic went above all of us combined. A king? Were you a knight? Why would you assume I was a knight? Huh? What do you mean? Nozomi sighed, glancing around for a moment. You've never heard this story before, but you automatically assumed I was a knight? And in all the memories I have of you, I have done nothing to show such an impression. But then I suppose this is the limit you have, Yukio. Even you are prone to making mistakes, especially with how much you have to manage in this world. Mom? What's wrong? What are you saying? Enough, Yukio, she said, glancing around again. I know you're watching this. I know what you've been doing, so why don't you show yourself for once? Mom, you're scaring me. I'm sorry, Shizuku, Nozomi said softly for a moment, turning back towards her. But you are nothing more than an illusion. A fake meant to keep me distracted. I'm a fake? Mom, what are you saying? I'm real. I know I am. Taking a hesitant step towards Nozomi, Shizuku slowly took another before breaking out in a sprint towards her. I'm real. I suppose that's why this is so sad, Nozomi muttered, letting go of the twins' hands before her hand reached out to the space beside her. I'm sorry. As Shizuku lunged out at her, her arms out wide in an attempt to grab her and convince her that this was real, Nozomi struck, her weapon being pulled out of her dimension and slicing through the girl before her. Shizuku simply came to a stop, her eyes slowly glancing down at the large slash across her body as she began to fall. Mom, why? Taking a step back away from the body as it fell, ignoring the blood starting to reach her feet, Nozomi looked around once more before calling out. Enough, Yukio. I'm tired of this game of yours. You actually did it, a voice came from behind her, forcing her to spin around before backing away to beside the twins that still stood there, their faces showing curiously at the whole situation. Standing over Shizuku's body was the very man Nozomi had expected to see, Yukio hovering over the blood and frowning at the sight of the girl's crumbled form. You've cut down Ichigo before, but the illusion was more obvious for you to realize. But I made a world so realistic that you would have certainly been unable to tell it apart from the real world very easily. And yet you were able to strike down a girl your own mind had begun to recognize as your own daughter without a second thought. You can do some cruel things, I reckon, but this. Tell me, when did you realize for certain that this was an illusion? I doubt it was a single thing really, Nozomi replied honestly. Though I began to first realize something was wrong the moment I began to think back on my memories. At first, I just assumed I had forgotten stuff about how my life had gotten to this point. Core memories existed, so I assumed the rest were just harder to remember. Until I realized that what I assumed were memory gaps weren't gaps at all. Rather, the memories that I did have seemed off instead. Impressive, Yukio stated, scratching his chin in amusement. Not many people realize that, you see. I can't just insert memories into your head, but what I can do is make you experience them. But I don't have time to do them all, so I focus on what would be core memories and rush through them, putting you through scenario after scenario of illusions in order to have your own mind create the memories for me. But alas, it isn't like you lived all those years. There are always gaps, though most never notice because they die before they realize the truth. Most never do care even if they do discover the truth. This is a perfect world to them, one where all their wishes for their life can be realized. A perfect world, huh? And yet I appeared to be getting sick and was going to end up leaving my family unhappy and grieving over my loss, with Ichigo still cursed to continue living as a result of his regeneration. It appears you have a misconception in what the worlds I make do. It's true that a perfect world to most would be one with no unhappiness. where everything turns out fine. But we also know the odds of such a world existing. It cannot exist because none of us can imagine it existing or how to reach it. You could do so, Nozomi pointed out. It would be a simple matter to make in this illusionary world. Yukio nodded. Indeed it would have been. However, such a lie would be easily exposed. You think you wouldn't notice it was an illusion straight away? You give yourself too little credit. You have always been fast at realizing when you are trapped, and those illusions were far better crafted than the one you are suggesting. No, a perfect world that I create is a world perfect to the one who is intended to be trapped in it, not in an ideal sense but in their own beliefs and realizations of what the world will do and be like. It isn't based on some lofty goal they know won't occur but facts and connections that they believe or know will occur in the world they live in. So that's why it was made in such a way, Nozomi muttered. The war ending, the life that took place after with its own share of happiness and sadness, it was all intended to be like that because that's how I might see things going down. Exactly, Yukio confirmed. You cannot imagine a world that you live in that does not have pain to go with happiness. You are too much of a realist to the affairs of the world. You know it can be cruel and unfair, so the world I made for you represented that. You would have a happy life, and then you would die. Die both satisfied with the life you lived and unhappy that you wouldn't be able to enjoy it more. And to the end, you would believe it was real. Or at least that was how it was meant to occur. Except this entire process took far longer than I initially expected. What should have taken a few days has taken weeks. It's been weeks. Ah, I forget that you wouldn't have been aware of the passing of time with how many scenarios I threw you into. You've been trapped in this dimension for a few weeks, though I know the question you probably want to know the answer to. How long have you been away from your world for? How long? Yukio shrugged. Honestly, I haven't paid too much attention. A few hours probably. I was watching you carefully, you see. When you dropped off Ichigo and made to return to your friends, I waited until you entered your dimension and then moved. It really did take some time to pinpoint it though, which is why it took so long for me to act before now. Every other time I've trapped you, you have always had a way out. I couldn't allow that this time. You found out where my dimension lies in relation to the others. Got it in one, Yukio confirmed. It took a lot of searching but I discovered it, and then when you took a foot in it I wrapped my own dimension around yours. You see, your little personal dimension only makes contact with Earthland when your magic activates. So there is a brief window of opportunity that is created when you enter U dimension, at which point the connection is broken. All I had to do then was wrap my own dimension around yours to prevent the connection from being re-established. And with how far away we are from your home dimension, time has moved a lot slower than for them than it has for us. However, I forgot for a time that you could still access it, Yukio admitted in frustration. Every so often you would slip in there or grab something out from there. In the beginning I bet you didn't even realize you were doing it, but you would occasionally store a piece of illusionary fruit in there and then later pull out a real one you had stored much earlier. You were trying to starve me to death, Nozomi muttered in realization. Once I realized the world was fake, I knew the food I was eating didn't help, even if it gave the appearance of it. It may have tasted real, and even made me feel like it was leaving me full, but in the end it was still an illusion. I didn't get any energy like I should have. Which is why the food I had stored in my own dimension was able to keep me going, much longer than you planned for. It was a pain to deal with. But once you started to weaken, I knew you were beginning to run out. That it would only be a matter of time until you would succumb. And yet, you were worried, Nozomi stated. The attack that just happened, the attempts on my life, that wasn't a logical part of your plan. That was you panicking, worried I had something up my sleeve. And when I didn't die there, you slipped up more. I saw how Ichigo looked when he reached me after the attack. He didn't know how to react at all, almost like such an event had never been planned for when he was created. Yukio crossed his arms, eyeing her warily. No one had lasted this long in my illusionary world. I knew you had to be catching on if you hadn't already. Your actions were beginning to arouse my suspicions. You were entering your own dimension more frequently, were acting more oddly than before, and I knew you must have been beginning to realize that anything you took into your own dimension was not actual appearing there. I did notice, though I pretended I hadn't. I found out only by accidentally, admittedly. I just went to check a pocket and couldn't find what I was looking for, only for it to reappear when I did get back. No matter how well crafted the illusions you place in this world are, in the end they are still only illusions that exist in this world. Not any others. Indeed, Yukio said with a sigh. It's such a shame though. I was granting you a kindness really, allowing you die in that way. But since you appear to have rejected the illusion, it leaves me with only two other choices. I could very well let you simply starve to death in the time you have left, but who knows how long that would take still. So I'll do this the only fashion way. With a snap of his fingers, the world began to change around them. Monsters of all shapes and sizes began to form, covering the landscape as far as the eye could see, while the sky began to turn red as an even more monstrous beast hung there far above. No matter how much magical power you have, Yukio stated, you cannot deny that your physical abilities have begun to diminish rapidly. If you had made a move earlier you might have stood a chance at lasting a bit longer against such an onslaught. Such a shame. Is it? Nozomi asked. Are you really sure? Wait, Yukio said as he raised a hand up, stopping all the monsters in their tracks before they could attack. What are you talking about? I dragged it out, remember. Once I realized what was going on, I could have acted then. But I didn't. I pushed the supplies I had to the limit and just kept living. Why is that? Yukio froze, noticing that Nozomi was turning away from him to instead look at the two boys still beside her. What do you think you know? These two are really odd, Nozomi said, crouching down beside the two boys who were still looking curiously at everything. Because in my newly made memories, I don't remember too much about them. I heard their voices too little, and then there are the odd parts about them. Placing her free hand on Yuato's head, she added, he's blonde for example, while Ryoji has black hair. Odd colors considering I have green hair and Ichigo has orange. So? What's your point? Anomalies occur from time to time. That's what I thought, Nozomi stated. Except they always felt so, real. Realier than anything else here. Taking her hand away from Yuato's head, she glanced back at Yukio briefly before slashing her weapon at Ryoji. No. The entire force of monsters lunged in, even the very ground shifting and trying to stop her, but it was too late to stop the blade from slicing off Ryoji's head. Nozomi couldn't bear to look at the sight for even a moment, turning away with a pain-filled look in her eyes for what she had done. Instead she did her best to focus on all the monsters still lunging at her, right until they faded away before her eyes. What have you? Yukio groaned as he clutched his head. It hurts. It's so loud. You can leave your world, can you not? Nozomi asked. Gray told me stuff about you. About how you were a human turned into a demon. About how you couldn't leave your dimension for too long without suffering consequences. This dimension is a major part of your body itself, isn't it? It's your very core, the source of your life and your magic, but for it to maintain its form even with you gone means that you aren't the core that keeps this world stable. Turning away from Yukio, she forced herself to look at the boy she had just killed. It's him. She felt a pair of arms grab her and almost swung her weapon on instinct. Only to stop when she looked, realizing it was Yuato. I was confused for a bit, she admitted, glancing briefly where Yukio was only to see him fading away. I knew trying to kill you would always be a wasted effort if I didn't even know if you were an illusion or not. And I didn't know which boy was the core. I had to think for quite some time. Until I realized that perhaps I shouldn't be looking at you as a singular individual. Yukio made to speak, but the words she heard came from beside her instead, forcing her to look at Yuato as he spoke. We were both one, Yuato muttered. Gray was lucky. Deliura was dead. When he was revived, it was his consciousness alone that returned. But I wasn't so lucky. The demon's mind mixed with my own. Neither knew who the original was anymore, and I was all that remained of myself. You're the human side of Yukio, Nozomi muttered softly, focusing fully on the boy in front of her. The human side that remained after what they did to you. Yuato nodded. I'm technically dead now. Me and Ryoji, we were technically what remained of each individual, acting as the cores of this place. I represented the mind, while Ryoji represented the power. You chose wise to kill him. You helped me, didn't you? Nozomi asked. If you two were so important, it would be foolish to have me so close to you in case I realized. And yet you were there anyway. I want to die, Yuato simply said. I didn't want to do what I did. I saw what I was doing in Ziref's name and I begged for it all to end. This wasn't what I had ever wanted. I got my revenge but at too much of a cost. But out there, I could do nothing. Even the demon wanted it to end. He was conflicted by his ingrained loyalty to Ziref and his desire for it all to end after all the experiments and suffering he was put under to make our fused self. I hoped someone would notice if they were here though, Yuato added. So I did my best to stay close. I even managed to make my fused self because fascinated by you, hoping that maybe you would be the one to realize the truth. And I knew he wouldn't resist the small influence we had on him to make sure we were there front and center in the illusion. The safest place is always the last place you think to look, and why would anyone believe such an important part of this world would be right under their very nose the whole time? He chuckled, even as cracks began to form in the space around them. It worked. It did. But Nozomi paused for a moment before pushing on anyway. If you don't mind me asking, why did you make that family life my perfect world? All you had to do was make one I would see as real. If you so wished, you could have merely pushed the war onwards in this world and make that the reality I lived in. I would have still accepted that and carried on so long as Ichigo was there to lead us. If it was possible as well, you could have even made a perfect world that lead back to Edalas provided you could bring about something that would convince me of the possibility. But instead you went the route you did, a route I was barely even considering. Why was that? You got in my head so much about Ichigo to push my thoughts to consider such a route like this. You made me realize stuff I was trying to ignore or pretend wasn't there, and brought it all to the surface so you could then use it to construct this final illusion. Even if I died, it would be a peaceful end. And then you inserted yourself into this life. Why? I just wanted. The man who attached me when your fused self started to panic looked like you. But he wasn't, was he? That was my father, Yuato softly admitted. The first man I killed after becoming a demon. I sent him after you because even in a world where I can make anything, he is always the image that comes to my mind when I think of a villain. I hated him. And my mother. And everyone in my family after that. They never cared for me. They never loved me. So I thought, just once before I died. You wanted to know what it felt like to be part of a real family, even if it was nothing more than an illusion. Nozomi finished for him, slowly patting him on the head. Was it worth it? Yes. Yes it was. That's good. Slowly releasing Yuato's grip on her, Nozomi took a step away as she prepared to use her magic to leave. Do you want to come with me? Yuato shook his head. I'll fade away the second I step out of this place, and I'll be gone in a few minutes anyway once this place falls apart. But thank you. Slicing out with her weapon, a rip opened for her to step through. Goodbye Yuato. I don't know if it helps at all, but for a time I did consider you my son. I'm sorry you have to die. It's fine, Yuato replied softly. This is what has to happen. Maybe though you can prevent another from dying today though. She paused as she was about to step through, glancing back once more with a frown. What are you talking about? My fused self spoke with Baragan. It's how he knew when to pull off this plan. He knows what Baragan is planning. You need to hurry, or he'll achieve his goal today. What is it? Nozomi demanded. What's he planning? I'm truly sorry, Yuato said before saying the words that would fill Nozomi with dread. You understand what Baragan wants now, I assume. You should hurry. If Baragan succeeds in his plan, he will have won. Protector of the Fairies. Welcome to the distorted realm. Cover me. Ichigo called as he immediately leapt back away from Baragan, swinging his sword in the process and blowing up the sand around them to block Baragan's vision. As Ichigo fell back, Shinji moved in as the blur he had been trying to keep track of faded into the distance. Baragan began to lunge out of the miniature sandstorm that had been made, ready to give pursuit, but Shinji was ready for that, a smirk across his face as he held his shikai in one hand and a crackling blue Siro in the other. And flip it all around again, Shinji muttered in amusement, firing off the Zero as Baragan suddenly tried to go in the opposite direction. However, right before the Zero could hit, Baragan managed to swing out his sword in the correct direction, having waited until the last moment to react. Before he could do anything else, however, Ichigo had burst into existence before Baragan's eyes and was swinging the large form of Tensou Zanjutsu down at the hollow before them. The axe Baragan wielded held strong against it, the handle barely catching the blow, but it wasn't able to stop the force of the blow. One moment Baragan was standing there, and the next he flung into the distance trying to recover. Ichigo didn't let him have that time willingly, kicking off from the sand and darting through the air towards the hollow. Rather than striking, he instead shot further past Baragan, his feet slamming into the ground and blowing the sand away as he forced himself to come to a complete stop, his blade being brought back around ready to slice Baragan down the middle. Mist exploded out from Baragan's form just before he was about to make contact with the blade, however, and without a second thought Ichigo had leapt back away from Baragan, disappearing into the horizon once more. While waiting for his friend to return, Shinji already had dug his sword into the ground and was charging 2 more Gran Ray Zeros, one in each hand. One won't work. Fine then. Take these. The 2 crackling Zeros darted off from his palms, distorting and bending through the air as they rushed across the large distance towards their target. He kept up his Shikai's usage, switching Baragan's perception every moment he could and throwing the hollow's attempts to dodge off every time he tried to move. But with the mist in place, his attacks ended up coming to nothing. The mist that Baragan had forced out from his body to push Ichigo back had covered too large of any area, and the moment the Zeros collided with it they were already beginning to lose their power. They exploded only a few meters away from Baragan, but that difference was enough to call the attack a failure. Unless his attacks made direct contact with Baragan, he couldn't call any of them a success because they wouldn't do anywhere close to the damage he needed to be done. That was the problem with Baragan right now. His resurrection. What had been an old man had now taken on his actual hollow form, not his imitation of human flesh. He just hadn't realized how much of an imitation it had truly been. Every hollow he had ever faced, mostly in this war admittedly, had an appearance that wasn't human. The Vastolords were the only ones who maintained a human-like appearance even in their resurrection state, but even then that was in shape and size. They were primarily humanoid, but that didn't mean they would still look human. Baragan though. There was no flesh there or a monstrous form to look at. Instead there was nothing but bones. When Baragan had used his resurrection, he could only assume that the energy that had been released had burnt away the man's entire body, leaving nothing more than the skeletal frame behind. A large purple cloak, with pitch black fur lining the collar, had been draped over the bones while golden chains hung down from out of the sleeves. The crown-like fragmented mask that had symbolized Baragan's status as an Arrancar had changed too, becoming a real golden crown, encrusted with jewels that must have been worth a fortune, that rested over the hollow's skull, while the eye that had been in the center of his old axe now rested as a pendant around his neck. He understood now why the hollow had claimed he didn't need instant regeneration. For Baragan, it was much more of a waste. Instant regeneration could remake bones, but the rest of its power would have been wasted on the hollow. Instead the hollow seemed to have developed an ability of his own to replace it. The technique was slower, much slower in fact, but any damage that Baragan took in battle was slowly being reversed as time went on. Cracks that formed across his body's bones would slowly begin to mend themselves, and that mist did a good job at keeping Ichigo back at times when he needed to recover. That mist was the other problem. The constant stagnation field around Baragan was gone now, but instead the aging process of the mist he made had been massively accelerated. Even a small amount of it could rapidly bring their attacks to the point in which they imploded too early. When his Gran Ray Zeros entered the field, it rapidly accelerated their time to the point in which they would reach instability and fall apart themselves, turning what could be a dangerous blow into nothing more than a minor nuisance. Ichigo's Bankai was providing a counter to that somewhat. He wasn't using any energy-based attacks, and was instead throwing around pure force and shockwaves to beat Baragan down with. The shockwaves themselves were being weakened, but even that mist couldn't completely bring them to the point in which their force had dropped entirely. There was just too much power behind them, and the end result was the massive chasing fight where they had to keep going after Baragan each time one of Ichigo's attacks sent him flying. Unfortunately, that same mist prevented Ichigo from getting too close. Ichigo had been caught by it only once so far, the mist barely managing to brush against one of his fingers, and within moments it had almost consumed the entire arm. If it hadn't been for his quick thinking to tear the arm off, it would have spread further and consumed him entirely, and due to the heavy burden his instant restoration was already under, it had taken much longer than normal to be regenerated. As a result of that, Ichigo had little choice but to be careful when approach and occasionally fight from a distance, where Baragan had the advantage when it came to neutralizing attacks. That didn't always work out so well for Baragan though, which was why the Hollow had that new axe in his hands. It was much larger than the original, with the axe heads extending down all the way to the end of the long slim handle they were connected to. It was a lot more of a slimmer weapon than the first, but the strength behind it had not lessened in the slightest. He had blocked one of those strikes so far, swung down at him with only one hand, and he had felt his bones crack under the pressure before Ichigo had pulled him out of the way and throw him to safety before Baragan had a chance to use his mist. The weapon wasn't easy to be disarmed either, not with the 4 golden chains attacked to the head of the weapon that connected down to Baragan's wrist. It was a tough fight, he had to admit that. They certainly had the advantage in raw power, and though he was sure Baragan could make a powerful Zero, he had yet to have time to fire one. But the danger was in that they couldn't truly finish the fight, not when Baragan kept using that mist. Ichigo could launch Baragan away into the distance, separating him from his barrier, but he was actually too fast to take advantage of the openings made. He would leap after Baragan and then pass him without even meaning to, unable to fully control his own speed. He was also sure Ichigo was holding back on some of his strikes, his eyes always glancing to where he was to be sure that it was safe to strike. A few times he had even seen Ichigo pull back away from an attack just because the direction of the slash put it in line with him. Shinji. He glanced towards Ichigo as a wave of sand scattered around him, Ichigo coming to an unsteady stop a few feet away from him. "How you holding up?" "I'll manage," Shinji stated, glancing at his still bleeding hands. Using Gran Ray Zeros also meant using up some of his blood, but he would need to use a lot more before he'd start noticing any adverse side effects. His magical power was more likely to run out first if anything was to happen. "You still doing well? No problems on your end?" Ichigo shook his head, the action seeming to be difficult for him with how slow he did it. "Hurt all over, but I can deal with that. But doing the same thing right now isn't producing many results. I keep missing him every time I send him flying. How's he even blocking those strikes anyway? He moves fast when he does that. Mavis reckons he's accelerating his body's time, making himself move faster for brief intervals. Around 2 or 3 seconds seems to be the limit of how long he can maintain it in real time though. The human body, or skeleton in this case, doesn't fare well under prolonged exposure to raw time. No wonder he never wastes it when dealing with me," Shinji muttered. "It probably takes everything he has just to manage to block your strikes. Is his weapon still holding up?" "Barely. It's a tough one, reinforced by his own magical power. It'll take more strikes to break it, but I'm getting there. But that might make him more desperate and release that mist more. Mavis said he should be able to extend it much further than he has already though. Are you doing something?" "Am I?" Shinji frowned before glancing briefly to his Zanpakuto as he pulled it from the ground. "Probably. Sakanade is reversing his perception so much. I'm amazed he is able to react under it. You said that knowledge of the Zanpakuto weakens it. He's had ample time to prepare to deal with you." "I know. I think he's probably doing tiny rapid movements as a way of testing his current state. He messes up a few times, but he does seem to be able to roughly get the directions right when it matters if he waits until the last moment. He's trying to prevent me from throwing off his timings, and even when I try sometimes it turns out he was bluffing to get me to do that. But thinking about it, you realized something?" "Yeah," Shinji said with a smirk. "He can extend that mist further. But he won't. And you're sure of this because he risks losing control of it," Shinji stated. "He can be thrown through it and he receives no harm, so we can assume he has some kind of protection from it. But what about when he is actively generating and spreading it? My Shikai must be interfering with his perception enough that he doesn't dare risk spreading it too fast, otherwise he won't be able to react in time and adjust his protection as appropriate," He can't use it in mass and expect to control it all while also constantly relearning how his body is reacting to his commands. That would explain the stronger layer of time magic held close to his bones, Mavis added, her voice appearing in the air much to Shinji's shock for a moment. Makes sense, he would have a way to protect himself from his own power in case of backlash. I can try and trick him a bit more, lead him into a false sense of security, but it'll be hard. Our other options right now mean hitting him with something he can't age rapidly enough. But my attacks can't do it. I might have something, Ichigo muttered. Problem is time right now. Any energy I absorb into my body gets immediately funneled into my instant regeneration to heal myself from the strain my Bankai is putting my body under. If I want to use an energy-based attack, I'll need to gather all the energy necessary from around me instead and shape it externally. I can do it, don't get me wrong, but you need some time to gather enough energy and won't be able to focus on fighting in the meantime. Exactly. Letting out a sigh, Ichigo added, we'll find another way. For now let's just dash. No, we should try this. Ichigo frowned, glancing at Shinji in worry. You understand the danger, don't you? You'll be fighting Baragan all alone while I prepare the attack. If I come and help you during that time, it'll result in that time being wasted, and there is still a risk of me being too slow to react if I don't realize the trouble you're in on time. We have to try something. Waiting around might work, but we should use that as a last resort and try and finish him before he starts getting desperate. If this attack can kill him dash. It won't, Ichigo stated. He's too powerful for that to happen. But it'll definitely create an opening if it does hit. Then let's do it. I'll do my very best to ensure he's wide open when that happens, so you can follow it up, so be prepared to move the second you see it make contact. I'll buy you the time you need until then. Alright then. Be careful. Protector of the Fairies. You're sure he'll be able to handle this? Mavis asked as Ichigo came to a stop in the distance, his eyes barely able to pinpoint Baragan charging forward towards where he could still see Shinji. Shinji's strong, but against Baragan, he won't hold out for long, not when Baragan is able to react to your attacks. Baragan won't risk accelerating his body when I'm not accounted for, Ichigo answered, slowly leaping up a few times and soaring through the air inadvertently as he tried to find a good height in the sky to stand it. He'll be too worried about a surprise attack coming when he least expects it, and he knows I can move fast enough to reach him even at this distance. He's a harder target to deal with than those Quincy gods were, but he'll certainly go down easier if I do hit him, and he knows that too. So then, what do you plan to do to hit him at this distance? A Getsuga Tenshou will definitely be powerful enough, but Shinji will never get out of the way in time. I'm aware of that, Ichigo stated, coming to a slow stop before eyeing the height he was at critically. Yeah, this will do. Trust me, Mavis, I've got a plan. Or rather, a version of me has a plan. I'd like to point out that this is only a half-tested plan, the voice of his Edala's self said, speaking up at mention of him. The delivery method is certainly sound, but the payload? Ask Zanjitsu about that. It'll work, the hollow side of Zanjitsu said in response. So long as you follow your instincts correctly and make the damn thing well enough. Now hurry up and do it. You're wasting time. I know, I heard you the first time, Ichigo said, carefully bringing his sword around before digging it into the air in front of him so that the edge of the blade faced away from him and the chain lay before him. Reversing his grip on the hilt, he extended it out at chest height before slowly closing his eyes. He had to focus for this. He still needed a large amount of energy for his instant restoration, so he couldn't afford to siphon too much away from the air around him. He could feel it move to his call, offering its aid freely as it began to take shape. Piece by piece, additional weight began to form. He kept at it for as long as he knew it would need before opening his eyes once more, coming face to face with the large beam of light the length of his Zanpakuto. Attached at the end where the blade acted as a guard around the hilt, it extended back up, mirroring the blade beneath it perfectly. As a result, from the end of the hilt upwards was a perfect replica of the blade below. It was fragile. He knew just from looking at it. While the quality of the addition to his blade was greater than any normal fake weapon he could craft, its essence being copied from the true version of the weapon he held, it was still likely to fall apart and fade if he swung it too quickly. Not that this was a weapon for swinging. The chain attached to the blade at the end of the guard began to extend upwards as new links formed and attached themselves to it, the point of which it connected being moved up until it mirrored how it connected to the blade at the bottom. After it was all done, the mirror image of the blade attached to his Zanpakuto made him think of one thing. A bow, and a massive one at that. "So that's your idea," he heard Mavis said. "You're using your Zanpakuto as a makeshift focus to build an energy weapon around, incorporating the old man's techniques to make it as solid as possible. But what are you planning to fire?" "Asiro," Ichigo stated as he slowly began to pull the chain back, the real and fake metal straining under his touch. Stretching out with one of the pale fingers gripping the chains so that it pointed forward, he began to condense some of the energy around them into a glowing orb, working carefully to try and convert it into the energy the Zero would require. It worked as he wanted, but keeping it under control with only one finger was proving challenging. Next came the hard part. Another finger slowly extended forward, blue light being gathered around it before extending out towards the Zero. Carefully directing it, he allowed the energy to form an arrowhead to encapsulate the Zero in. Only once he was sure he had managed to link up the Zero to the arrowhead did he lowered his first finger, pushing all that energy into the arrowhead and allowing the Zero to eat away at some of it to keep it going while he built the rest of the arrow. The rest of its shape formed quickly. The hard part was already done, and while the Zero was small he knew it had a lot of punch to it. Especially if it made contact. He would have liked to have used a more powerful variant honestly, but he knew the arrow he wanted to fire would fall apart within seconds if he tried that, way before he would have a chance to fire. But a normal Zero? That could last long enough for this. Finishing up its shape, he knocked it against the chain as if it was string, additional energy beginning to spread across the links to help amplify its power. His experience with this was greatly limited, he knew that. Right now he had to rely on the instincts of his Daedalus self, the one who had fired these all his life, and then use his own strength to give the arrow the punch it would need. This makeshift bow was probably the only thing capable of handling his strength in this state, but it also wasn't much of a bow either. The chain would only fling forward due to his own strength having strained it back, threatening to break it in two, and he would have to hope the force it would unleash as it was released would shoot the arrow far enough through the air. Now all he had to do was aim. He could see Baragan, but Shinji was still too close. He wasn't anywhere near confident enough to be sure he wouldn't hit him like this. He had to wait a bit longer. Long enough for Shinji to have a chance to break away. He was sure a chance would show itself, Shinji's Shikai would allow it. But when? Now. He reacted immediately to his Daedalus self's voice, releasing his grip on the chain and watching as it slammed into the makeshift arrow and flung it forward. At the same time he could see Shinji breaking away from Baragan, one of the Hollow's swings having gone in an odd direction and giving his friend a chance to retreat back and recover. Bracing himself, getting ready to rush forward the moment the arrow hit, he watched the arrow fly through the air for a moment. His Daedalus self had been right with his aim, it looked like it was heading there perfectly. But without the energy he had been fueling the arrow constantly, it was now on a limited time frame. The Zero would still be eating away at the energy acting as its container, and the moment it ran out it would unleash its full payload wherever it was. Relax. Trust me, it'll make it. The words calmed him down a bit, allowing him to focus as he prepared to move. His Zanpakuto had already almost finished returning to normal. The extensions to the sword and chain had already began to break the second the shot was fired and the chain's end was reattaching itself to his sword's base. That meant there would be nothing to slow him down now. Baragan began to turn from the look of it, seeing the projectile flying towards him, and was beginning to raise one hand as mist began to form. But it didn't spread out far until it halted. The question left would be whether it could eat away at the arrow fast enough with its current speed. He got his answer when the arrow hit the mist and then continued going right towards Baragan's chest, the shell of the arrow yet to break. Right before it could reach Baragan it finally failed, but the moment the arrow fell apart its payload was unleashed. The bright red Zero that had been contained within erupted forward, unleashing all that energy right before Baragan's eyes and slamming into his body. That was his cue. His feet slammed against the air behind him as he began to move, and within a moment he was landing on the ground behind Baragan, glancing over his shoulder as the hollow was thrown back from the blast. The mist was beginning to respond, but after only a second its pace suddenly slowed drastically. Shinji was keeping up his eye of the bargain, it seemed, keeping Baragan occupied. Now was the best chance he had. With another strong kick off the ground, he was right before Baragan, his sword being swung down. Baragan's time acceleration kicked in, the hollow's body beginning to move faster than it should be able to, but there was too much of a difference in speed. His swing couldn't be redirected or stopped, and as a result he ended up slicing straight through Baragan's left arm as the hollow tried to move, severing it at the shoulder. He wasn't done yet. As Baragan tried to retreat back, about to summon his mist, he stepped in, preparing to slam his fist straight into Baragan's head before he could recover and to cave it in from the blow. Darkness appeared before he could make contact. His first slammed into a forming wall of darkness as it suddenly spread up before him. Immediately he was trying to retreat back from it, only to slam into a wall of the same energy, his eyes inadvertently coming to rest on the skeletal arm he had severed. That and the crushed remains of a black cube still resting in it. He knew what this was. He had seen it before, when Baragan and his fellow hollows had escaped Ethereon's blast. But it was acting far faster if it was able to form this quickly. And for Baragan to have this prepared. Shinji. Run. This is a trap. He wasn't sure how many of his words got out before the void closed completely around him, leaving him in nothing but darkness. Protector of the Fairies. Shinji froze at the sight he had just seen. Almost faster than he could blink, that dark energy had shot up from Baragan's severed arm and had encased Ichigo within it. And then both had been gone, as if neither had been there at all. He knew what that energy was. He recognized it. That energy he had seen was the energy found in the Gargantes the hollows used. Indeed, Baragan said, Shinji not even realizing he had spoken out loud. This is a tool I had my men devise. Useful if we need to make an emergency escape. It won't have killed Ichigo, I'm afraid. But it will have trapped him. And with his level of strength and power, I reckon he'll be out of there in almost no time at all. Glancing at where his arm had been, now gone along with Ichigo, Baragan let out a sigh before flexing what was left at the joint. Such a shame, however, that I had to give up my arm. I can heal, but high-speed regeneration is still beyond me. Though I suppose giving it up for the time being is a worthy sacrifice for this chance. He had to get away. Now. Buying Ichigo time was one thing, and it had been worth it to see that sudden Zero shot through the air as an arrow and slammed directly into Baragan. A Zero was always strongest at its epicontre, and that epicontre had been delivered directly to Baragan. But buying time when Ichigo was still a viable threat was very different to trying to fight Baragan alone. It was an impossible task even. Time to go, muttered Shinji before taking off with a few steps of Shunpo. He had only been traveling for a few moments when the telltale sound of Sonido could be heard, Baragan appearing behind him and swinging his massive axe down with his single arm. His sword was swung quickly in response, but the blow sent him skidding back, one of his arms beginning to hit him with bursts of pain. Was it broken? It felt close to being, he reckoned. Okay, need a new plan. It was apparent by that move just then that Baragan did not intend to let him run away. If he couldn't regroup with the others though, he'd just have to find other ways to handle this situation. If he could somehow draw the others here, make a signal that requested urgent help, then. They aren't coming. What was that? Not quite sure, I heard you over there. Your behavior does little to hide your fear. You understand your situation and are afraid. You cannot beat me alone, so you immediately begin to consider how to get the aid you need. It will not work. Oh. Keep him talking. If he couldn't reach help right now, buying time was the next best thing. Ichigo would return eventually. And why is that? Because I ensured it, Baragan replied, speaking with pure confidence that his words were true. I ensured only the strongest of my soldiers remained here. And Ulquiorra was the greatest of them. Even if Tyr has failed me, Ulquiorra cannot even in death. I have already felt the traitor in my ranks fall, and the others you brought with you are either too far away now or too weak to do anything. My soldiers did their roles perfectly. Except Ichigo is only trapped temporarily, Shinji pointed out with a smirk. You've only bought yourself a bit of time. Do not underestimate what someone can do with a bit of time. There is so much that can be done. So much that can be achieved. So much that can hurt someone. I should know. My guild was killed in the same time it will take Ichigo Kurosaki to return to this place. Was that time accurate? He wished he knew how long it had taken Ichigo to kill Poison Viper now, but he hadn't ever felt it appropriate to even ask normal details about that event, let alone something like how long it took. But it couldn't have lasted too long. Don't bother trying to work out it, I know you want to know. So I'll tell you. It took 20 minutes. 20 minutes, in which my guild fought, struggled, bought time, and then tried to flee. None of it worked, and their attempts only let them last 20 minutes as a result. I did my research, utilized the strongest time magic I had just to have a look at the events that unfolded that day. In 20 minutes' time, Ichigo Kurosaki will break free from that jail I have made in the Garganta and he shall return here. 20 minutes. Only 20 minutes. That's hardly what I would call trapped then for even a brief amount of time. You're stalling. No, I am not. Shinji paused at any retort he wanted to make to that, the sheer confidence in those words making him freeze. In fact, I actually have exactly what I have been aiming for from the very start. I do not need to delay him long. In fact, I do not wish to. I only need 20 minutes to do what I have been waiting to do for a long time. Except you've trapped the very person you want to kill away from you at that time. What's your plan here? You won't be able to reach the barrier during that time. Anything you might try and do would fail with only a short time to act in. Except the one thing I have been aiming for since the beginning. Again, he's not here. You can't kill. Words ended up caught in Shinji's throat, conclusions in his mind slowly beginning to take shape. This isn't about killing Ichigo. You finally understand. Ichigo must die, and I desire that so much. But from the very beginning, I have been patient. Patient enough to allow him to catch up to my own power after I surpassed them, and then even patient enough to watch him surpass me again. Because I did not wait all these years just to simply kill him. I have been waiting to do so much more than that. It was beginning to click. Blue Note's orders back on Tenro Island. Ulquiorra's presence there. The other Shinigami Hollow hybrid, Kaname-tuan, in the Grand Magic Games after my life. From the very start you've been trying to kill me. I've done more than that, Baragan stated, amusement slipping into his voice as he was finally able to tip the hand he had held hidden for so long. Did you ever find it odd how you were able to escape Mayuri's lab when he had the rest of your friends murdered? How it was odd that an escape path would even exist there in the first place with how careful Mayuri was with his methods. I didn't care if it was you or any of the others, I just needed a wizard. One who would inevitably find their way to Ichigo. That's a lie. Is it? Well, feel free to think what you like, but trust me when I say that I have been waiting for this moment for a very long time. Shinji frowned, while internally running over the time he had in his head. Baragan had said 20 minutes, right? That time was already counting down, and had been since Ichigo had been trapped. If Baragan wanted to keep talking, he'd let him do just that. Except you tried to have me killed plenty of times before. What would have happened if they succeeded? Then you would have become a failure and I would have changed my plans accordingly, Baragan stated. But you didn't die. You survived. You grew stronger. And the stronger you became, the more reliable you became. Yours powers may have become a separate problem, but they were a manageable one. Because finally you were at a position where Ichigo would be able to rely on you implicitly and take you into the worst battles imaginable. And this war became the perfect ground for that. People have died in this war. Don't pretend you care about them. I don't. I still don't get something though, Shinji stated. You said you wanted Ichigo to be able to rely on me? Why me? There are others that already fit your goals. No, they didn't, denied Baragan. Because I didn't need them. What do you mean? Exactly that, Baragan stated. Levi McGarden and Laxistry are both some of, if not the, closest friends Ichigo Kurosaki has. Except they are also loyal to their guild, with the latter even its new guild master. The girl may have followed Ichigo, but she would have been torn between the two choices. What about Mistogen and Nozomi? I've seen enough of them to know one thing. They started down this path because there were no other options available to them. The man running from his past chose to follow the man who gave him an option, the only option he had. While the girl fell apart to begin with when he died, which helped me realize she had just as little reason to exist as the man named Mistogan did initially. No matter what things are like for them now, they started this way out of only one option. Kisuk then. We both know the answer to that one. Kisuk Urahara does what he desires and nothing else. No, I needed you. You who had options after you survived Mayuri's lab. You who chose to follow Ichigo anyway. You who made him your family and chose to only concern yourself with him. You had options, you had choices, but because he was there that day you decided to stay by his side and throw those options away. That is why I need you. To die. But this isn't about me dying, Shinji muttered in realization. What you're after. That's why. For you it's never been about killing Ichigo. It's always been revenge. You aren't trying to just kill him. You want him to suffer. You want him to feel the same pain you felt. You want to kill me to break him. The man who had bound himself to Ichigo Kurosaki and forever forsook any other bonds. The one man here who no one could ever deny is only here because of Ichigo Kurosaki. You aren't fighting this war for some noble bond, for some freedom you might obtain, or even anything personal beyond living. You are here today, on what would have been a suicide mission in the eyes of many, because Ichigo Kurosaki might need you. Because you would risk everything for his sake, and he knows that. So what face do you think he'll make when he finds out that, in the 20 minutes he was trapped for, you died by my hands? I understand it now, Shinji muttered. Yes, this is your whole goal here. Ichigo can only die when he becomes as broken as you became. You want to bring him down to your level first, make him experience the same pain, so you can ensure Ichigo Kurosaki dies one way or another. Except what happens if I live past those 20 minutes, huh? What happens then? You won't. You want to bet? Shinji asked, leaping back a few steps before throwing his Zanpakuto up into the air and letting it begin to spin around the circle attached to the hilt. Because I've still got one card left to play. One no one has seen, and one I've been hoarding for a very long time. Bankai. I knew you'd fall back on this, Baragan said, backing away himself as energy exploded off Shinji and began to obscure his vision. No matter which Shinigami it is that the world knows about, their Bankai's existence has always been confirmed, even if its abilities are unknown. All except for you. There was no doubt in my mind that you possessed a Bankai, in fact the sheer ability you have with your Shikai and the connection shown with it confirmed it in my eyes. But not once did you use your Bankai, not even if it might be the key to saving your own life. But you'll use it now to protect Ichigo by living. Shinji Hirako. I truly did chose the perfect candidate for my revenge. You say that now, Shinji said, his voice reaching Baragan before suddenly he could hear it coming from behind him. But are you sure you didn't make a mistake? Messing with sound now are we? Maybe, Shinji's voice came again as the energy began to clear, revealing him standing where he still was. Except the sound to Baragan's senses was coming from his right now. Though you could just be seeing things wrong. Perception is a tricky thing, isn't it? Spreading his arms out, Shinji gestured around them as the air began to shift, large flashes of light forming as light shifted and bent around them to form a massive barrier, and at the very center of that at the top of the dome it made was the sword Shinji had thrown up, its ring spinning around and unlatching the sword from itself. The sword fell and slammed into the ground point first before Shinji, the Shinigami slowly reaching out and pulling it up as the rest of the area around the finished settling. Welcome to the distorted realm, Shinji said with a smirk, holding up the simple form of his Zanpakuto. I suppose it doesn't look that fancy right now. But it's the best tricks that are the simplest. These are mirrors, Baragan stated as he began to notice his reflection forming on the edges of the barrier. A cage of mirrors, reflecting the very light around us and causing an endless series of reflections if one was to look deep within. Is this the game you plan to play? To confuse my perception more by increasing the complexity my sight has to deal with. If you think it's so simple, then go ahead and try and reach me. See if you can cut me down. With pleasure. Baragan took a step forward, bringing his axe ready to his side, only to falter and stumble the moment he tried to take his second step. What's wrong? I'm not that way. Baragan glanced at his body for a moment, seeing the odd direction he had tried to take a second step in, before looking back at Shinji. "Oh, I should ask, do you think you're looking at me?" Before Baragan's eyes, the man's form shifted and became a reverse of itself. "Or are your eyes playing tricks on you? Am I real? A reflection? The reversed perception of your eyes? Can you even tell at all? What are you saying?" Baragan snarled. "Stop these games and speak properly." "Alas, it's already begun," Shinji stated in amusement, the sound of a pendulum being heard all around them. "My words are already becoming distorted to you, as even your perception of sound becomes twisted and morphed to my will. This is the ultimate trick in my arsenal. You should be proud. You made me decide to use it after all." "You can't hear this properly," Shinji added, watching Baragan trying to stand and move, "but I'll tell you it anyway. This is my Bankai. Sakeza Sakanada Matsue Ashurai. Protector of the fairies. Goodbye, my dear friend." Baragan leapt after Shinji as he once more tried to put distance between the two, closing the few meters between them before Shinji could get far. At least he assumed he had done so. His axe swung down, but it ended up at his right, as if he had swung it to the side. That was no matter. A purple Zero was already charging, held within his skull's jaw, and fired. He realized he shouldn't have done so the second the Zero was released, the blast slamming against him instead of shooting straight forward. He knew he had aimed correctly, done all the same steps as always. But his perception of them all was too warped. Even so, he continued to push on, forcing his way out of the explosion of energy his attack had produced by slamming against him. The Zero was too weak to harm him, only meant to have confirmed whether or not he could hit Shinji with it. Right now, Shinji was further away than he had been before. Much further, in fact. He made to take a step after him, only each step seemed to take him further away. He swung his axe as he continued to back away, not trusting what he was seeing for a single moment. Whether by chance or not, he felt a weight hit his axe as his swing continued backwards. He couldn't take satisfaction in that though, not when the weight pressing against his axe seemed to shift and bend around it with every passing moment. "What's wrong?" A voice came from behind him. "I'm over here," it came again, this time much quieter and far further in front of him. He could see the image of Shinji ahead, but he couldn't even know if his doubts were right or not. At first glance, the person in front of him looked right. But on closer inspection, there were differences. A cut present on his clothes before, for example, was now on the opposite side, and the way the hair parted was also reversed. It was like looking in a mirror. And that was where the confusion lay. It was possible that it was a result of a reflection from one of the mirrors, projecting a false image from wherever Shinji had managed to hide himself. But there were plenty of other options too. Were his eyes seeing this correctly? Was his perception of Shinji being flipped so that he saw a reverse of the man in front of him? Or could it even both, with each being alternated one after the other? It was impossible to tell. Which was the point? Shinji gave a brief wave before saying, "You still haven't worked it out yet? Am I the real Shinji? Or are your eyes playing tricks on you again? You can run all you like, but it will not last forever." Shinji shrugged before tilting his head. "Are you sure about that?" he asked, his image flickering in Baragan's mind. At one moment it appeared like Shinji was tilting his head one way, and then the next it was the other. It happened so fast that he knew it had to be on purpose, and with how often it repeated itself it gave the appearance of Shinji having two heads, both moving and talking in sync. "You look like you're having some trouble." "Trouble? You speak too highly of yourself if you think this will slow me down at all." "Well, it has been doing that well so far," Shinji said, both heads smirking. "My Bankai, Sakeza Sakanada Matsue Ashurai, is very good at what it does. Can you tell which way you're facing? Or moving? And is that even right? Enough of your tricks." Baragan roared, swinging his axe forward and released a wave of purple mist. It rushed forward towards Shinji before tearing straight through him, leaving nothing behind. But it didn't travel much further. Baragan knew himself how dangerous it would be if his perception was off too much in relation to his own ability. "Oh, not bad," Shinji said, each word coming from a different direction. "But alas, you missed. You're still swinging at thin air. Walking closer towards Baragan, Shinji held up his Zanpakuto before swinging it down. He had hoped to get a clean hit, but he knew something had tipped Baragan off. Whether he was too slow on his swing, didn't manipulate his presence well enough within his Bankai, or even because he was too predictable, in the end his strike was blocked, Baragan's axe forcing him back as it slammed against his sword and knocked him away. Baragan began to turn to look at him before stopping, and Shinji knew what he was looking at. It was a version of him that Baragan assumed was the real one. Backing away carefully, he did his best to plan his next move, keeping up with his manipulation of Baragan's perceptions as the hollow rushed towards where he assumed he was, at times struggling to move correctly. Sakeza Sakanada Matsue Ashurai. It was a lovely Bankai in his opinion. Captured a lot of himself in it too. He enjoyed messing with people. He liked manipulating them, watching how they acted when he manipulated their perception. And he was good at it. His Shikai showed what he could do, and his Bankai took it a step further. If his Shikai could invert one's senses, then his Bankai allowed full flexibility on that control. Where before up and down could have been switched, now up could be left and down could be forward. The effect was so much stronger than his Shikai, infecting the mind to a far greater degree and messing around with the actions the brain wanted and the actions the body took. And he could do this so much more selectively too. Different legs could have different mappings. Just because moving the left foot right takes it forward, it doesn't mean that the right foot follows the same pattern. And even if the pattern was learned, he would simply alter it quickly afterwards, always keeping the enemy struggling to remember and trying to train their body to react to the new responses they would get from their actions. But it was a pointless effort. The stronger the fighter, the more they would come to trust their instincts and react to them. If it took years to train the body to that level, trying to retrain it was a fool's bet. And even reacting to those instincts if you could was a challenge in itself. Was the object before you really there? Or was its position merely an illusion due to manipulated perception? The mirrors that surrounded them both, encasing them, only amplified his ability to manipulate Baragan further. No matter how much Baragan tried, the mirrors would continue to cast down multiple reflections of himself. Finding the real one out of all these copies might have been easy if not for the fact he continued to alter how the visual images of them appeared once they reached Baragan. Were they truly reflections? Was one of them the real one? Such questions would plague Baragan's mind because any of them could be the real one. However, there was one thing he had yet to be able to trick. Sound, sight, even normal sensing, it was all distorted thanks to his Bankai. He could manipulate how Baragan perceived all of them with ease, but that was only because he knew how to. He could manipulate them because he could comprehend how such abilities worked. But Baragan was Nuken. That mere fact changed things. He couldn't see it, but he knew there would be magic circling Baragan in the air. It had been what alerted Baragan to Ichigo the moment he got too close. And that was something he couldn't stop. He didn't know how to sense the magic in the air like Hanuken could, especially when he couldn't see it, so he also had no way of understanding how to alter Baragan's perception of that sense. Whenever he got too close and struck, Baragan was able to pinpoint his position perfectly in that moment and move to block his attack. Well, not perfectly he supposed as he watched Baragan tear apart another of his copies, his axe held almost against his neck where it had barely been stopped in time before Baragan could have accidentally killed himself. However, Baragan was pinpointing him normally, it only occurred at a very short range around the man's body, acting as an immediate warning system to any danger. Further back he was safe, and so long as he backed away in time after each strike it was easy to confuse Baragan once again. That one sense was not quite enough for Baragan to do more than block. Still, it was slightly troublesome. He still had more time that he had to last for, and he was honestly starting to get a bit worried. He had never used his Bankai in a battle like this before. In fact, the only time he had ever used it was once, the first time he obtained it, and he hadn't been fighting anyone then. He hadn't quite expected the drain it would have on his magic, nor how much that was amplified by his constant switching of senses. Most enemies wouldn't need to be micromanaged this much. He could have just altered a few and used the openings it would make to end them. But when he was so outmatched outside of his Bankai, he knew he had to use his Bankai to its fullest just to keep Baragan in check. Would he last long enough? He might be able to buy slightly more time if he could deal some kind of wound to Baragan, enough that would let him ease up for a few moments. It wouldn't spare too much magical power, but it could mean the difference between life and death if it came down to seconds. Moving in, he alternated his speed with each passing moment, at times throwing out taunts while at others making noises with his blade as it swung through the air. Those sounds would always reach Baragan the same normally, but with careful manipulation each would sound like they were coming from different directions and distances. He could see Baragan whipping his head around, glancing at him and the other reflections before leaping after the nearest one. Ah, that wouldn't do. Before Baragan could fully comprehend what was happening, he was back where he started and lunging towards a different reflection, the copy mirroring his actions like all of them did. It was hard to pull tricks like this off, he would admit it. To get Baragan back where he started, all the while not realizing, it required careful manipulation of his sight's perception while altering the perception his body had of its movements, making him think he was moving forward when in actual fact he was turning back, all reflections being matched perfectly in his eyes to ensure nothing might look amiss. It wasn't just about making Baragan chase after a different target though. Baragan was getting too close to one of the walls. He had managed to seal Baragan's use of time magic to a great extent with his Shikai, and that continued to work here in his Bankai. But if a little bit of it reached a mirror when Baragan was close enough, it would spell trouble. That had been Baragan's original intentions in fact, to damage and destroy the mirrors, but he had worked overtime to ensure that Baragan was never able to get too close to one, lest his Bankai become damaged and weakened as a result. Seeing Baragan closing in on the reflection he had directed him towards, he gave chase. Sounds echoed all around Baragan as he did so, masking his approach as a smirk grew across his face. Now was the hard part. He would have to time this just right, as if he struck too soon or too late he would be detected by Baragan and caught. And while he was confident in how much he could manipulate Baragan's senses normally, he knew there would be no escaping if he was caught in the Hollow's grasp. As Baragan struck, swinging his axe down only to have it being swung to the left and pulling his whole body into the swing, he saw his chance. The axe came incredibly close to him as it passed, almost slicing his stomach open, but he narrowly avoided it, stepping in the second it passed his body as his sword sliced up. Baragan tried to move in time, and did succeed to some degree. He knew Baragan must have managed to pinpoint his position accurately through sensing the disturbance made in the magic around him, but that was only just enough to get him moving in the right direction. His head still shocked back and forth as he tried to dodge the sword heading right for it, his altered perception throwing his attempts to dodge off. In the end, he just about succeeded, Shinji's Zanpakuta slicing across the skull and taking away a large chip across its side. Immediately Shinji was leaping back, pushing his manipulations to the max as mist exploded out around Baragan. It didn't expand though. It just hung there, motionless for a few moments before vanishing entirely. It seemed Baragan wasn't going to tempt being caught off guard with his control and just wanted him to back off. Well, that was fine with him. And while Baragan had his eyes locked on him, he could afford to let up with his manipulations for a brief moment to rest, without having to worry about managing the reflections and how they were perceived too. Not a bad look for you, he called over, adding in a brief amount of work on Baragan's perception of his voice to keep the illusion going. I bet your father would say that you're a chip off the old block. Your games grow tiresome. Tiresome? Not for me, Shinji said with a smirk. I'm having the time of my life. If anything, you should be more worried. I've already managed to wound you, even it is superficial at best. This is only to get worse for you from here on out. Those are the words of one trying to bluff their way out, Baragan said with a sneer. You are weakening. I can tell by how hard you try to stop me from sensing your magical power. You aren't just altering where I sense it but also how high I read it. You don't want me to know how fast you are running out, but by doing so you also reveal your hand. Or I could just be trying to not give anything away. You ever think of that? Yes. But this is a Bankai. It is more than enough proof to support my words. Bankais put great strain on their user, and you will hit yours too. The only question left is when. Shinji shrugged, his smirk never dying in order to hide how he felt. Baragan was hitting the nail on the head here, but it didn't matter if he knew that. Bluff, lie, trick. That was all he had to do. because pretty soon, Ichigo would be back. He was keeping track, and doing so careful too. There was around 4 minutes left. 4 minutes in which he had to survive for, and he felt like he could still do so. All he had to wait was 4 more minutes, Baragan stated to him, the knowing tone in his voice snapping Shinji out of his thoughts. That is what you are thinking, no? You can try and mask it, but I can tell the difference between someone who is stalling and someone who is fighting. And you are the former. You simply believe you need to last that last bit of time and you will win when Ichigo returns. Unless you lied about that, Shinji stated, begging internally that he hadn't. For all I know, he might not appear for another hour. No, he will appear. There would be no point in containing him for that length of time if not to ensure he would be able to be released at the appropriate moment. Still, I suppose it is time I should wrap this up. I have wasted enough time with these games, and I still need to ensure the final piece is put in place. Oh really? And how are you going to do that? Shinji asked, allowing his control to shoot back up to full. He had his break, now was time to get serious again. Letting Baragan talk was all well and good, but if the Hollow was going to try something then he had to be ready for it. You're not very good at moving in my Bankai, though I'll give you credit for what you've managed to do thus far. Not many people adapt to my Bankai as quickly as you do. I assume it's that time magic of yours at play there. Indeed. It is easy to adjust if I take a brief moment to test my body's reactions. But that is not necessary anymore. Mist slowly began to spread out from Baragan's body, hanging closely around him as the energy it was made of grew darker and darker. Baragan's hand slowly came up, shaking as it went as it felt its path wobble and get pulled in countless directions as his perception altered, until it was aimed at a Shinji far to the original's left. Let us end this now, he said, the mist tearing forward for a brief moment. And then Baragan's perception changed and found the mist slamming into his body and surrounding him once again. You don't learn, do you? Asked Shinji before frowning. His eyes then slowly began to widen as he felt Baragan's magical power rise further, and then his expression began to make way for horror as the first signs of something appeared out of the mist. It was a hand, made entirely of bone. It slammed into the sand ahead of the mist, a bit closer to him than he would have liked, and just looking at it screamed at how massive it was. The length of the hand was about the size of his own body, and the arm it connected to ended in the mist that was slowly spreading higher and higher, despite his best attempts to manipulate Baragan's senses to prevent this. A head appeared next. He recognized it immediately as Baragan's, though he supposed the crown was a good indicator. The only difference was that it was massive now, and as the mist cleared away he was treated to an equally large body that the arm connected to. The purple cloak that had been wrapped around him before was gone, as were all the chains and jewelry, and it even appeared that the arm Baragan had lost to Ichigo had returned if the giant left arm had anything to do with it. However, things were missing. More specifically, the lower half of Baragan's body. The spine ended up in the sand, and as the body began to fall forward slightly he was treated to the site of the ribcage opening. Each of the ribs extended down and slammed into the sand, holding Baragan up with the assistance of the support his right hand was giving him. He wasn't sure what to think of, whatever this was. In taking this form, Baragan had gained size and his other arm and in exchange had lost his entire mobility without his legs. He was barely held up above the sand, and there was no sign of any weapon anywhere to be picked up and used. Resurrection, segunda etapa, Baragan stated, his voice coming out slowly as if the jaw was having trouble moving. Only 2 hollows have this, one of which is now dead. And you broke that out for little old me? I'm flattered, really, but look at yourself. Shinji gestured at the giant body before sighting. Well, suit yourself. Easier for me. I only have to hold out a tiny bit longer. Let's get this over with. He frowned. As Baragan opened his jaw, more of that purple mist was being released. It didn't take him long to realize how much had been expelled, nor how fast it was beginning to extend out around Baragan. No, that won't do, he muttered, and with a thought he had the perception reversed. But it didn't stop. It continued to expand, extending out like a sphere. Already enough had been released that Baragan's form was no longer easily visible within. It was only when he took a glance at the sand beneath the mist too did he realize what was occurring. As it aged, it continued on and on until it just vanished, as if it didn't even exist any longer in any shape or form. He couldn't stay where he was. Not when that mist was still expanding. He quickly began to alter Baragan's perception more as he retreated back, but it did nothing to slow the mist's speed down, and in only a few moments he found himself at the edge of his Bankai, with almost no room left to run within it. He had no choice. He couldn't stop the mist, and so with a heavy heart he stepped outside of the field his Bankai had made and retreated back further, watching as it was eaten away by the expanding field of time magic. He could still control Baragan's perception without the mirrors, but now things wouldn't be nearly as easy when there was only one visual target. "Is that where you are?" came Baragan's voice suddenly, a giant skeletal arm stretching out of the mist right before him and almost catching him off guard. Backing away just far enough to get out of its reach, Shinji was treated to a brief look of Baragan once again, the hollow skull fading back further into the mist as the arm retreated. That was too close to comfort, he knew that for certain. But how had Baragan pinpointed him so precisely? His perception should still be warped. Darting back further, he realized quickly that he was being chased as the mist began to expand towards him, faster than he could outrun it. Waiting until the last second was all he could do before he darted up, narrowly avoiding the mist as it shot past him. It came to a step not far behind him, however, continuing to expand and circle back around. "You're in there, aren't you?" Shinji muttered, shooting up higher into the sky. The mist beat him to it, however, chasing him down and passing him to cut off ways of escape. It was then that he saw the skull again as the mist suddenly began to extend back down, Baragan's giant form briefly visible as it began to close off his ways of escape. He tried to find a way out, chasing down the largest openings available to him, but each was cut off one by one as the mist continued to surround him. Only when he was completely trapped within did Baragan show himself completely once again, his form extending out from the mist and looking down at him from above, each breath the hollow made causing more and more mist to form from his mouth. From how his body moved within the mist, it almost looked like it was floating in there and using the mist to carry its body around, as if swimming through it. Scowling at the sight, Shinji held out one hand before muttering, "Bakuda number 73, To Zanshao." From the point in front of his hand, blue energy extended out around him before forming an inverted pyramid. At each point, a blue line extended out further, slamming into the mist before rapidly being eaten away. It wasn't going to last, Shinji knew that, but it was still buying himself some time. Now if he could just delay Baragan for a bit longer. Pain interrupted his thoughts, the barrier before him shattered thanks to the force of one skeletal finger breaking through it and piercing his chest. He frowned at the sight for a brief moment, confused at when Baragan had even moved, before he felt an even worse pain. "What did you dash?" He couldn't even finish his sentence before he was coughing up blood, his chest feeling like it was breaking apart at the seams. And upon a brief glance, he realized that it was. Slowly, as if it was taking its time, purple mist was leaking into his wound from Baragan's finger, aging the flesh around the wound until the skin broke apart entirely. You bastard," Shinji snarled out through the pain, his Zanpakuta slipping from his hands and falling down into the mist below. Oddly he noticed, the mist seemed to part before it, retreating back and slowly revealing the ground below. "What did you do? How did you manage to move like this? You should still be under the effects of my Bankai." Silence greeting him, only making him angrier when combined with the pain. "Answer me. I said dash. Are you saying something?" Baragan asked. The tone made Shinji freeze. Not because it sounded arrogant or cruel, but because it sounded unsure. "It is hard to know, but I figure you would be right now. Unfortunately, words are wasted on me right now. I cannot hear you." Shinji was about to snarl back a response when he saw how Baragan was looking at him. While at first glance it might be assumed that it was him being looked at, in reality his gaze was slightly off to one side. And not once had the hollow responded to his taunts in this form. Did he? "You can't see," Shinji muttered in shock. And it wasn't just that he realized. Baragan couldn't hear him either, and he would bet that the hollow couldn't smell either. No wonder his Bankai had stopped worked. This form, it had removed Baragan's senses until all that remained was the one thing he couldn't manipulate. And after that Baragan had simply let loose his power now that he had nothing left to fear. So lost in his panic, He barely registered the voice that called out to him as Baragan ripped his finger from his chest as the mist slowly disappeared around them. Shinji, protector of the fairies. In an empty void, Ichigo continued to swing again and again and again, each strike bringing him one step closer to freedom. How much longer, Mavis? Not much longer. You're almost through. Just keep it up. Ichigo nodded, continuing to swing and using the force each strike emitted to push at the dimensional cage they were in. Whether they had ended up in the Gargantat, it was deep in it, hidden behind layer after layer of folded space. The only way through was to use enough force to smash an opening back out when struck this deep, which was the purpose of using these swings. Cracks had been beginning to form for a while now, but it still was taking longer than he wanted. Shinji was still out there. He knew what his friend was like, and he'd probably be trying to find a way to hold on until he returned if he couldn't flee. So to return that favor he couldn't rest for even a second. He had to hurry up and force his way out of this cage. With one final swing, he finally managed to do so. A rip appeared across the path of his blade, opening up across all the cracks in space and revealing the place he had been standing before being trapped before. The rest of the space folded behind him as he stepped out, closing up once again without him adding the ridiculous amount of pressure on it to force it open. Immediately he was searching for Shinji's magical power, and instead found Baragan's first. He wasn't surprised, not with how massive it was, but it was a shock to find out how much higher it had reached in the time he had been trapped for. His head snapped towards the source, seeing the massive amount of purple mist in the distance that was trying to fill the horizon before his eyes latched onto a single point where he could sense the other familiar magical power. Shinji. He wasted no time at all, darting forward with all his strength and barely noticing how the mist seemed to pull back away towards a central source. He ignored the giant form of Baragan that he saw briefly as it vanished into the mist, his eyes only seeing Shinji's falling form, and before Shinji had time to blink he had the man in his arms and was letting them both fall to the ground in a controlled manner. Only when he looked down at his friend as he placed him on the sand and crouched beside him did he realize the true depth of the situation. Shinji. He recognized that mist, lingering around Shinji's wound in his chest. That was Baragan's magic. That was his time magic, the one that could eat away at an object in an instant if Baragan so wished it to. Sorry, Ichigo. Guess I couldn't last long enough, huh? Shinji tried to chuckle, to put on airs like always, but pain greeted him instead as he tried. Looking at Shinji, Ichigo could feel the time magic around his friend's wound intensifying, causing him greater pain as it ate away more and more of his body. Hold on a minute, Ichigo stated as he looked at the wound. This will hurt, but if I cut this away then dash. Ichigo's words fell short when Shinji's leg suddenly broke apart, having aged decades in mere moments. What on earth? It's pointless, Baragan's voice spoke to him, Ichigo's head snapping up to see what remained of the mist retreating back and revealing the form Baragan had taken before, his previously lost arm restored and his purple cloak reforming around his body. I have already infected every part of his body with my time magic. With but a thought, I can kill him. Then why haven't you done so already? Shinji muttered between bursts of painful grunts. You're waiting for an opening, aren't you? Nothing of the sort, Baragan replied. It would be pointless to act yet. I will allow you time to say your farewells. Because soon, there won't even be a body left to bury. Bastard, Ichigo snarled, one hand tightening around his sword while his gaze eyed the distance between them critically. There was almost no mist left now, and if he moved as fast as he could and struck just as quickly then he could. A scream of pain from the man in his arms destroyed all of those thoughts, his head snapping down just in time to see one of Shinji's arms wither away. I said say your farewells, Baragan stated in annoyance. If you try to even think about attacking me, I will simply finish him off first. Ichigo wanted to shout back at the hollow before an arm grabbed at one of his own, forcefully drawing his attention. Struggling to pull himself up, Shinji managed to move so that his back was towards Baragan. Listen to me, Shinji muttered as quietly as he could. Baragan has a second release dash, another scream of pain erupted from his throat, nothing visibly disappearing which only made Ichigo fear what Shinji might have just lost, and left Shinji struggling to breath as a result. I said say your farewells. Trying to lower his voice more, Shinji forcefully continued with, it's time focused. It's all it is. Something else broke apart inside Shinji, but this time his friend stomached the scream he wanted to release. Baragan was doing this to make it even more painful, he knew this, and yet Shinji didn't appear to care. It was like he didn't want to give Baragan any more satisfaction. Be careful against it. There could be more to it. He lacks normal senses in that state. It made him resistant to my Bankai. You actually used it. Out of everything, that was actual the thing he doubted the most. He barely knew of Shinji's full capabilities with it since the man was so insistent on saving it for an emergency greater than his own life. Shinji nodded. This was a trap for me. Promise me you won't blame yourself for this, no matter what Baragan says. What? Blame himself? Was this? He had brought Shinji here, or rather his presence had encouraged the man to follow. Because of that. Couldn't this be considered a direct result of his own actions? From the very start this was his intention. It's all about hurting you. Everything. But I chose to be here, Ichigo. Never forget that. I don't understand. Shinji, what are you saying? He did understand. But he didn't want to. Because understanding only made the pain he was feeling worse. He'll try and hurt you with this, Shinji continued to say, ignoring Ichigo's confusion. Don't listen to him. Don't even let him speak. Just strike him down before he can. I know you can do that too. Because you're stronger than he, I can say that for certain. Shinji. No. Don't say stuff like that. If he was stronger than him, he would have already won. If he was stronger, this wouldn't even be happening right now. But most importantly, those words sounded too much like last words. He didn't want to hear stuff like that. Shinji smiled. He didn't know if Shinji still felt any more pain, but he was sure it was still there somewhere. I want you to know that I wouldn't have wanted anything else from life. Because I met you, I was able to find family again. I was able to meet others that I could relate to, others who I could trust, and others who I could fight for. There's got to be a way to save you. Mavis. That was right. He had access to time magic too. If Mavis could use her experience with it, maybe they could save Shinji in time. Perhaps if they sealed him inside Fairy Sphere and prevented time progression, then they could still save him. You can do something, right? If we can isolate Dash. I don't regret a single moment, Ichigo, Shinji stated happily, using his one remaining army to pull himself up higher and pull Ichigo into a hug, causing his words to freeze up in shock. We will always be family, and for that I have always been so happy. Thanks to you, my world didn't end the day Mayuri killed everyone else. Thanks to you, I was Dash. What words Shinji wanted to say were lost entirely when what remained of his body broke apart into dust in Ichigo's arms, slowly being scattered by the wind as it slipped through Ichigo's fingers. What had Shinji been about to say? What were those words he was meant to hear? I'm sorry, Baragan said mockingly. Did I interrupt him? Was he saying anything important? Shinji. No. This had to be a lie. An illusion. A trick. This wasn't real. None of it was. It couldn't be. It truly is such a shame, Baragan stated, mist being to extend from his body in far greater quantities than before. He was such a talented individual. His skills were top-notch and his powers unique enough to allow him to challenge even some of the strongest out there. Such a bright future he had, one that was unfortunately stolen. Because of you. Ichigo froze for a moment, the words registering in his mind before he slowly pushed himself to his feet, his grip tightening on his sword's hilt. What did you say? You heard me. Do you want to know the reason I targeted your friend? The reason I played so many games to ensure he died? Baragan slowly raised a hand before gesturing at Ichigo himself. It is all because of you. Me? That's your excuse. Because of him? Was that true? Call it what you wish, but you know it to be true. The prize of Lumen Histoire in this war does not interest me. It never has, and you know this. The death of thousands doesn't either, it is merely a side effect. What I wish is the destruction of you, but doing so physically is not enough. It would never be enough. So first, I will destroy your soul. That is why I targeted Shinji Hirako. Not for some special reason, not because of some threat he might pose, but because of you. That is the simple reason he died. Because he was connected to you, and for no other reason apart from that. Shut up. He didn't want to hear this. He couldn't bear to hear this. Hadn't Shinji told him to silence Baragan as quickly as possible? He needed to do that. He needed to do that now. Oh? Do you not like what I'm saying? I said shut up. The mist sprung up to defend Baragan the moment Ichigo shouted, Baragan knowing it was the only way it would make it in time. It was fast enough that Ichigo forcefully came to a stop right before it, swinging up as fast as he could and releasing a shockwave that sent Baragan flying back. You know it to be true. Shouted Baragan, trying to recover in the air as more mist expanded out rapidly around him. I have observed Shinji for many years now. And at so many turns, he either denied the other paths he could have taken in life or followed you regardless whether you had to ask or not. Because of you, he was willing to follow you to hell itself. If you might need his help, he was willing to be there in a heartbeat and to put his own life on the line. How does it feel? Knowing that his life was extinguished only because he was your friend. I said shut up. Roared Ichigo from above, slicing down with his blade and releasing another shockwave that slammed Baragan into the ground. He didn't want to hear this. Not these words. Anything but these words. He already knew better than Baragan did how far Shinji had been prepared to follow him. He knew better than anyone how loyal Shinji was to those he considered family. In the end, he would have lived if you had not decided to travel with him after you met him. If you had never built up bonds, if you had never been his friend, I would have never decided to even pay attention to him. But because you were close, because he was an ally always willing to risk himself for you, I knew he was the one I would kill. Perhaps now you understand my own pain and why I hate you so much. I told you already to shut up. Energy gathered all around Ichigo's blade, being drawn in from the environment and slowly beginning to surround it in a large field of energy. Get Yuga dash. It was your fault. Baragan roared out, using one hand to open up a garganta behind himself. I may have done the deed but you enabled me to do so. From your actions today to even this war itself. It all rests on your shoulders Ichigo. Tenshou. The blast shot downwards just as fast as the sword took to swing but the mist that rose up to stop it still ate away at it just as quickly, devouring the attack until only small pieces of it managed to break through and slam into where Baragan was. But as the smoke cleared, all that was visible was the closing portal of a garganta. No you don't. Ichigo roared, slamming into the ground full force and slashing up at the closing gap as if to rip it open. Before it could connect however, the last of the garganta closed entirely, causing the swing to pass harmlessly through the air. That sight barely registered on Ichigo however, nor did the lack of Baragan's magical power present around him. Instead he simply brought his sword back around and sliced down at where the garganta had been opened. You don't get to just run away. Ichigo roared, slamming his blade down full force into the ground and causing the sand to scatter in all directions. Come back here. Ichigo. Calm down, Mavis said, trying to reach him with her voice. Baragan's gone. He's not here anymore. I said come back. Slamming his blade down once again, more sand scattered before Ichigo discarded the blade entirely and tried to grasp at where the garganta had been. You don't get to run away. Ichigo. He's gone. No he's not. Roared Ichigo, desperately trying to reach for where the garganta had been to somehow pull it open. He knew it was possible, Shinji had done it. Shinji. The name only made him try harder. He's not getting away. He couldn't let Baragan get away. Now not. Not after what he did. He had to. He had to. He's already gotten away. Mavis shouted at him, taking physical form behind him in an attempt to use physical contact to snap him out of it. As her arms wrapped around his waist from behind, he froze in her arms. Let go of me Mavis. He's gone Ichigo. He's gone. I said let go. This was wasting time. There was still a chance he could chase after Baragan. He could do so. The reason Baragan ran was because he didn't want to continue fighting. Didn't that mean he was weak right now? This was his chance. He couldn't just let it go like this. You can't chase after him now. It's too late. I told you already, Ichigo muttered, his voice breaking slightly, let go. He had to keep up the chase. If he didn't, then what was today even worth? What did they even achieve? If he couldn't kill Baragan right now, then none of it, not a second, was worth a bit. Ichigo. He's gone. He can't be, Ichigo muttered, slowly falling to his knees and almost dragging her down with him. I can't. I can't let him go. Not yet. His gaze slowly shifted away from where the Garganta had been before his eyes came to rest on a blade still resting in the sand nearby. That's Shinji's Zanpakuto, Mavis muttered softly. Ichigo. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Ichigo barely heard her as he stared at the blade. So many images were flashing through his mind, so many that he remembered like they were yesterday. The day they met, where Shinji pulled him and Toshiro into hiding with him to avoid Mayuri. The days they trained together, both learning how to use their inner hollows to their fullest and how they might start trying to achieve Bankai. The joy he had felt when Shinji had decided to stick around with them and join Fairy Tail with Toshiro. Even during this war, Shinji had been able to be there for him like always, willing to follow him into any situation. And then one thought shattered all the rest. He was right. What? Baragan. He was right, Ichigo muttered. It was my fault. I started this. Ichigo, he's getting into your head, Mavis muttered warningly. Don't listen to him. Remember what Shinji said? It doesn't matter, replied Ichigo. Because Baragan was right. His beef is with me. It's only ever been with me. He stared at the sword, the memories he remembered now beginning to hurt. He didn't even notice as his Bankai began to fade around him until he finally ripped his eyes away from it, unable to take the pain he felt from looking at it. It's my fault. A roar erupted from his throat as he raised his fist and slammed it back against the ground. Damn it! Damn it! He raised his fist once more before slamming it back down again. Then he repeated the action, again and again and again as his roars of pain and anguish slowly broke down with each strike until finally his hand stopped, resting against the ground as tears began to fall and the roars made way for cries of pain. Shinji was gone. He was gone forever. Dead. There wasn't even a corpse left to mourn over. And all of this, it started from the same place. From a decision he made, so long ago, that led to the man Baragan became. If he hadn't done that, if he had taken different choices afterwards, if he had never met Shinji. I'm sorry. Ichigo muttered, his hand pressed up against his eyes as he cried. Shinji. I'm sorry. I never should have dragged you into this. I'm sorry. This was my fault. All of it. Please forgive me. Please. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Mavis could do nothing beside him but hold him, any words she said falling deaf on his ears. She wasn't sure how long that went on for, Ichigo continuing to utter words of apology towards Shinji in between sobs, until finally there was silence, and all that was left before her was a man with empty eyes. Protector of the Fairies. Check the description for the links to the author.